Hey there, night owls! Tonight we're talking about a family so spectacularly cursed, they make the Kardashians look like a functional household, the Stuarts. 4 kings in a row, and every single one of them walks straight into the same brick wall. Parliament, religion, and an absolutely unshakable belief that God personally handed them the crown. Spoiler alert, God did not return their calls when things went south. This is a dynasty that started with the son of a beheaded queen taking the throne of the very country that killed his mother. Let that sink in. And it only gets wilder from there. We've got gunpowder plots, civil wars, a king literally losing his head, another one fleeing in the middle of the night, and enough family betrayal to fuel 10 seasons of prestige television. Before we dive in, smash that like button if you're into royal disasters, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from tonight? I want to know which corner of the world is staying up late for some Stuart chaos. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and settle in. We're about to trace a bloodline from Scottish moors to London scaffolds, through fire, plague, and revolution. The Stuarts didn't just fall, they crashed in spectacular slow motion, and they took an entire era down with them. Ready? Let's begin. To understand how the Stuarts managed to turn the most powerful throne in Europe into a family curse that would span 4 generations, we need to start with a woman who never actually sat on that throne herself. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, mother of the first Stuart King of England, and quite possibly the most unfortunate monarch in British history. Her story is one of those tales where you keep waiting for something to go right, and it just never does. She was a queen before she could walk, a widow before she turned 19, and a prisoner for nearly 2 decades before losing her head on the orders of her own cousin. Not exactly the fairy tale ending one hopes for when born into royalty. Mary came into this world in December of 1542, and she came into it screaming, which, given what was about to happen, seems entirely appropriate. Her father, King James V of Scotland, lay dying just a few miles away, having recently suffered a catastrophic military defeat at the hands of the English. When news reached him that his wife had given birth to a daughter rather than a son, he reportedly turned his face to the wall and muttered something along the lines of "It came with a lass, and it will pass with a lass." He was referring to the Stuart dynasty itself, which had gained the Scottish throne through a woman. Apparently, dying kings have time for dramatic prophecies about the downfall of their entire bloodline. Within a week, James V was dead, and his infant daughter was Queen of Scotland. She was 6 days old. The crown they placed on her tiny head might as well have been made of thorns. Scotland in the 1540s was not exactly a stable environment for raising a child monarch. The country was caught between the competing interests of England, France, and various Scottish noble factions, who all had their own ideas about who should really be running things. England's King Henry VIII, that notorious collector of wives and severed heads, immediately saw an opportunity. He proposed that the infant Mary be betrothed to his young son Edward, which would eventually unite the 2 kingdoms under English control. When the Scottish Parliament rejected this proposal, Henry responded with what historians delicately call the rough wooing. This involved sending English armies north to burn Scottish towns, destroy abbeys, and generally make life miserable for anyone who thought Scotland should remain independent. Nothing says romance quite like artillery bombardment. The Scots, understandably, decided that perhaps the English were not ideal marriage partners after all. Instead, they shipped the 5-year-old Mary off to France, where she was betrothed to the French Dauphin and raised at the most sophisticated court in Europe. For the next 13 years, Mary lived in a world of poetry, music, fine wine, and elegant conversation. She grew tall and beautiful, fluent in multiple languages, accomplished in dancing and horsemanship, and utterly unprepared for the brutal realities of Scottish politics. The French court was a finishing school for princesses, not a survival course for ruling one of the most fractious kingdoms in Christendom. This would prove to be a significant oversight. In 1558, Mary married the Dauphin Francis, and when his father died the following year, she became Queen of France as well as Queen of Scots. For a brief moment, it looked like Mary had won the lottery of Renaissance royalty. She was 18, beautiful, Queen of 2 countries, and married to a young man who adored her. Then Francis died in 1560, probably from an ear infection that spread to his brain, because 16th century medicine was essentially guesswork with leeches. Mary was a widow at 18, no longer Queen of France, and suddenly very much in the way at a court that had a new king and no further use for her. She had no choice but to return to Scotland, a country she had left as a small child and barely remembered. One can only imagine her feelings as her ship approached the Scottish coast in 1561, the elegant gowns and Renaissance poetry of France giving way to the grey skies and grim castles of her homeland. The Scotland that greeted Mary was a country in the grip of religious revolution. While she had been growing up Catholic in France, learning to appreciate fine art and theological nuance, Scotland had gone Protestant with a vengeance. John Knox, a fire-breathing reformer with a talent for making enemies, had led a movement that overthrew the Catholic Church in Scotland and established a stern Presbyterian system that viewed anything resembling pleasure with deep suspicion. Knox particularly despised the idea of female rulers, having written a charming treatise called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. His opinion of Mary, a Catholic queen who liked dancing and wore fashionable clothes, can be safely assumed to have been unfavourable. Their meetings were legendary for their mutual hostility, with Knox reducing the Queen to tears on more than one occasion, while showing absolutely no remorse about it. He was not what you would call a people person. Mary attempted to navigate this minefield with a policy of religious tolerance that pleased almost nobody. She kept her Catholic faith privately, while allowing the Protestant Church to operate freely. This compromise satisfied neither the Catholics, who wanted their Queen to restore the old religion, nor the Protestants, who viewed any Catholic on the throne as a mortal threat. Mary was trying to find a middle ground in a country where the middle ground was rapidly disappearing, swallowed up by the expanding armies of religious certainty on both sides. It was like trying to moderate a debate between people who were already reaching for their swords. Then there was the matter of marriage. A young, beautiful, widowed queen was expected to remarry, and Mary's choice of husband would have enormous political implications. England's Queen Elizabeth, Mary's cousin, was particularly interested in this question because Mary had a strong claim to the English throne as well. Through her grandmother, Margaret Tudor, Mary was descended from Henry VII, which made her next in line after Elizabeth herself. Elizabeth never married and had no children, which meant that Mary or her descendants might one day inherit England. This prospect delighted Catholics, who considered Elizabeth illegitimate and wanted Mary on the English throne immediately, and terrified Protestants, who envisioned a Catholic reconquest of England led by the Queen of Scots. Elizabeth suggested that Mary marry Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, who happened to be Elizabeth's own favourite and possible lover. The logic here was that if Mary married a man loyal to Elizabeth, the Scottish Queen could be kept under control. Mary was not enthusiastic about this idea, possibly because accepting Elizabeth's leftovers was not exactly flattering. Instead, she chose Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a tall, handsome young man who was also descended from Margaret Tudor and thus strengthened Mary's claim to England even further. Unfortunately, Darnley turned out to be a terrible choice for reasons beyond his bloodline. He was vain, stupid, jealous, and had a drinking problem that made his other flaws considerably worse. Within months of the wedding, Mary realised she had married a disaster in human form. The marriage deteriorated rapidly into mutual hatred. Darnley was furious that Mary refused to grant him the crown matrimonial, which would have made him king in his own right rather than merely king consort. He became convinced that Mary was having an affair with her Italian secretary, David Rizzio, a talented musician who had become one of her closest advisers. Whether there was actually anything romantic between Mary and Rizzio remains unclear, but Darnley certainly believed there was, and he was not the type to handle jealousy with quiet dignity. In March of 1566, while Mary was 6 months pregnant, Darnley led a group of armed nobles into her private chambers, where they dragged Rizzio away and stabbed him over 50 times while Mary watched in horror. The murder was partly about eliminating a hated rival, but it was also intended to shock Mary into miscarrying, which would eliminate the heir that might otherwise displace Darnley in the succession. Fortunately for the future of the Stuart dynasty, Mary survived the trauma and gave birth to a healthy son 3 months later. She named him James. The relationship between Mary and Darnley after the Rizzio murder was, unsurprisingly, not warm. They maintained a facade of reconciliation for political purposes, but Mary clearly despised her husband, and the feeling was mutual. Then, in February of 1567, something remarkable happened. The house where Darnley was staying, recovering from what may have been syphilis, exploded in the middle of the night. When the debris was searched, Darnley's body was found in the garden, apparently strangled. The explosion had been caused by gunpowder placed in the basement, but Darnley had somehow escaped the blast only to be murdered by other means outside. It was a crime so bizarre that it almost demanded a conspiracy theory, and conspiracy theories were exactly what emerged. Suspicion immediately fell on James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a powerful Scottish noble who was rumoured to be Mary's lover. Whether Mary herself was involved in her husband's murder has been debated for over 4 centuries. She was certainly happy to be rid of Darnley, and her subsequent actions did nothing to dispel suspicions of her guilt. Just 3 months after Darnley's death, Bothwell abducted Mary, though how much resistance she actually offered is questionable, and they were married within weeks. The Protestant lords of Scotland were outraged, not so much by the murder of Darnley, whom nobody liked, but by Mary's apparent willingness to marry his probable killer. They raised an army, confronted Mary and Bothwell at Carberry Hill, and forced the Queen to surrender while Bothwell fled into exile. Mary was imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle, a fortress on an island in the middle of a Scottish loch, which is about as escape-proof as 16th century prisons get. There she was forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son, who became King James VI of Scotland at the age of 13 months. Mary managed to escape after nearly a year of imprisonment, gathered an army of supporters, and was promptly defeated at the Battle of Langside. With no options left in Scotland, she made the fateful decision to flee south into England and throw herself on the mercy of her cousin Elizabeth. This was, in retrospect, perhaps the worst decision of her life, though given the competition, that is saying something. Elizabeth faced an impossible dilemma. On one hand, Mary was a fellow queen, and monarchs did not generally approve of subjects deposing and imprisoning their anointed sovereigns. On the other hand, Mary was Catholic, had a claim to the English throne, and was surrounded by suspicion of husband murder. Simply letting her go was out of the question. She would immediately become a rallying point for Catholic plots against Elizabeth. Executing her was equally problematic, both because it would set a dangerous precedent and because it would likely provoke war with France and Spain. Elizabeth's solution was to keep Mary in comfortable but secure captivity in England, neither quite a prisoner nor quite a guest, while various diplomatic solutions were explored. Mary remained in this limbo for 19 years. 19 years of moving from castle to castle, of writing desperate letters to anyone who might help her, of watching her son grow up in Scotland without her, of gradually abandoning hope of ever regaining her freedom. During this time, she became the focus of numerous Catholic plots to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne. Whether Mary actively participated in these conspiracies or merely allowed herself to be used by them is another question historians still debate. What is certain is that Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, was determined to find evidence that would implicate Mary directly and justify her execution. Walsingham got his chance with the Babington Plot of 1586. A young Catholic gentleman named Anthony Babington organised a conspiracy to murder Elizabeth and rescue Mary, communicating with the Scottish Queen through letters smuggled in beer barrels. What Babington did not know was that Walsingham had intercepted every single letter and was reading them before passing them on. When Mary wrote a response that appeared to approve of the assassination plan, Walsingham had his evidence. Mary was put on trial for treason, found guilty, and sentenced to death. Elizabeth hesitated for months before signing the death warrant. The execution of an anointed queen was unprecedented, and Elizabeth worried about the implications for her own position. If subjects could execute one monarch for alleged crimes, what was to stop them from executing another? There was also the personal dimension. Mary was her cousin, her blood relative, and however much trouble she had caused, killing family was not something to be done lightly. Eventually, under intense pressure from her council, Elizabeth signed the warrant, though she later claimed she had not intended it to be carried out immediately. This excuse convinced nobody. On the 8th of February 1587, Mary Queen of Scots walked into the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle to meet her death. She was 44 years old, prematurely aged by years of captivity, but still possessed of the dignity that had characterized her throughout her troubled life. She wore a black gown over a crimson petticoat, the liturgical colour of martyrdom in the Catholic Church, and carried a crucifix and prayer book. The execution itself was botched horribly. The first blow of the axe struck the back of her head rather than her neck. The second blow cut through most of her neck but left a small piece of sinew attached. The executioner had to use the axe like a knife to finish the job. When he held up her severed head and proclaimed "God save the Queen," the head fell out of his hands and rolled across the floor. Mary had been wearing a wig, and her real hair, grey and cropped short, was revealed underneath. A small dog that had been hiding under her skirts emerged and refused to leave her body. It was a grim end to a grim story. But Mary's death was not the end of the Stuart story. It was merely the prologue. Because in Edinburgh there was a young king who had never really known his mother, but who was about to inherit everything she had lost. James VI of Scotland had been raised by Protestant tutors who taught him to view his Catholic mother with suspicion. He had been told from childhood that Mary was an adulteress, possibly a murderess, and certainly a threat to the Protestant religion. When news of her execution reached Scotland, James made some pro forma protests, but did not let his grief interfere with his chances of inheriting the English throne. Elizabeth was getting older, had no children, and had never formally named an heir. James intended to be that heir, and he was not about to jeopardise his prospects by making too much fuss about his mother's death. This calculation paid off handsomely. When Elizabeth I died in March of 1603, having finally named James as her successor on her deathbed, the son of the woman she'd executed became King of England. Think about that for a moment. The country that had held his mother prisoner for nearly 2 decades, that had tried her for treason and cut off her head, now welcomed her son as their sovereign lord. James rode south from Edinburgh to London through cheering crowds, showered with gifts and praise by subjects who had despised his mother. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers, though James himself seemed perfectly comfortable with the situation. He was a practical man, and practical men do not let awkward family history stand in the way of a crown. James I, as he was styled in England, he remained James VI in Scotland because apparently consistent numbering was too much to ask, was an unusual figure in many ways. He was the first monarch in over a century to come to the English throne as an adult with a family of his own. His wife, Anne of Denmark, and their children provided a ready-made succession that had been lacking under the childless Elizabeth. He was also highly educated, having written books on topics ranging from witchcraft to the divine right of kings to the evils of tobacco. Yes, tobacco. James published a treatise called A Counterblast to Tobacco, in which he described smoking as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. 4 centuries later, the medical profession would catch up to his opinion, though presumably with more rigorous methodology. But James brought more than just his intellect and his family to England. He brought Scotland, in a sense, and Scotland brought its own complications. The union of the English and Scottish crowns under one monarch was called the Union of the Crowns, though it was really more of a personal union than a genuine merger. England and Scotland remained separate kingdoms with separate parliaments, separate legal systems, separate churches, and separate identities. James may have worn both crowns, but he could not simply combine the 2 kingdoms into one. This did not stop him from trying, and his failure to achieve a full union would set the template for Stuart ambitions throughout the century. Grand visions constantly frustrated by political reality. The Scots who accompanied James to England were not universally welcomed. The English court was suddenly full of Scottish nobles with thick accents and unfamiliar customs, competing for royal favour and the lucrative positions that came with it. English nobles who had spent years cultivating relationships at Elizabeth's court found themselves displaced by northerners they barely considered civilised. The Scots, for their part, viewed the English as soft, decadent and unreliable, comfortable in their wealthy southern kingdom while Scotland had spent centuries fighting for survival on the margins of Europe. These mutual suspicions never entirely disappeared and would resurface repeatedly in the conflicts that followed. James himself was acutely aware of his Scottish identity and the way it marked him as an outsider in his new kingdom. He spoke with a noticeable Scottish accent that he never entirely lost, and his manners were considered rough by the standards of the English court. Elizabeth had been famous for her elaborate ceremonies and careful management of her public image. James was informal to the point of seeming undignified, preferring hunting to court ritual and surrounding himself with male favourites who received extravagant gifts and intimate access to the king. The contrast with his predecessor was stark and not entirely in James's favour. The Scottish character that James embodied, shaped by centuries of struggle, clan loyalty and fierce independence, was both an asset and a liability for the Stuart dynasty. On one hand, the Stuarts had a toughness and determination that came from ruling a kingdom constantly threatened by larger neighbours. They had learned to survive through cunning and flexibility when brute force was not an option. On the other hand, they brought with them a set of assumptions about kingship that did not translate well to the English context. In Scotland, the monarch was first among equals in a society dominated by powerful noble clans. In England, the relationship between crown and aristocracy was different, mediated by institutions like Parliament and common law that had no real equivalent north of the border. More fundamentally, the Stuarts brought with them the belief in divine right monarchy, the idea that kings received their authority directly from God and were answerable to no earthly power. James had written extensively on this subject, arguing that kings were gods on earth, fathers to their people, and the source of all law. He did not invent this doctrine. It had been floating around European political thought for centuries, but he articulated it with unusual clarity and passion. This was not just a political theory for James. It was a deeply held religious conviction. To challenge the king was to challenge God himself. This belief would prove catastrophic when it collided with the very different beliefs of the English Parliament, which held that the king's power was limited by law and tradition, and that Parliament had rights that not even the monarch could override. The English, you see, had a different understanding of how governance worked, forged through centuries of their own experience. The Magna Carta of 1215, however mythologized it became over time, established the principle that even the king was subject to law. The development of Parliament as an institution where taxes had to be approved and grievances could be aired had created a political culture in which negotiation and compromise were expected. English monarchs had certainly pushed back against these limits. The Tudors had been masters at getting their way, but they had generally worked within the system rather than against it. Elizabeth I, for all her imperious manner, had been remarkably skilled at managing Parliament, flattering its members, and making them feel included in decision-making, even when she was manipulating them shamelessly. James lacked Elizabeth's political finesse. He viewed Parliament as an annoyance, a necessary evil to be tolerated when he needed money but otherwise to be ignored. His speeches to Parliament were lectures rather than negotiations, explaining to the assembled members why they should do what he wanted because he was the king, and God had made him so. The members of Parliament listened to these speeches with increasing irritation. They were not accustomed to being treated like schoolboys receiving instruction from their master. They were the representatives of the English people, at least the property-owning portion thereof, and they expected to be consulted, not commanded. The conflict between James and Parliament was not immediately catastrophic, but it established patterns that would intensify under his successors. James needed money constantly. The Elizabethan treasury had been depleted by wars with Spain, and James had expensive taste in favourites, entertainment, and building projects. Parliament controlled the purse strings, and its members were increasingly reluctant to fund a king who seemed to spend lavishly while ignoring their concerns. Each parliamentary session became a negotiation in which Parliament demanded concessions in exchange for taxes, and James demanded respect and obedience that Parliament was less and less willing to provide. The constitutional confrontation that would eventually tear the country apart was already visible in embryonic form, but finance was only one arena of conflict. Religion was another, and arguably more dangerous. James had grown up in Presbyterian Scotland, surrounded by ministers who believed that church governance should be in the hands of assemblies of elders rather than bishops appointed by the king. He had chafed against this system all his life. The Scottish Kirk had not been shy about telling him what God thought of his behaviour, and one of the attractions of England was that its church was more congenial to royal authority. The Church of England had bishops, and those bishops were appointed by the Crown, which gave the monarch considerable control over religious affairs. James intended to extend this episcopal system to Scotland as well, and to suppress the Presbyterian elements that had made his youth so uncomfortable. He also had to deal with the religious pressures from both extremes in England itself. On one side were the Catholics, who hoped that the son of Mary Stuart would be sympathetic to their cause, and might restore some of the freedoms they had lost under Elizabeth. On the other side were the Puritans, English Protestants who believed that the Reformation had not gone far enough, and that the Church of England needed to be purified of its remaining Catholic elements, bishops, vestments, ceremonies, and anything else that smelled of Rome. James pleased neither group. To the Catholics, he offered initial tolerance that quickly gave way to renewed persecution, especially after the Gunpowder Plot of 1605 demonstrated what some Catholic extremists were willing to do. To the Puritans, he offered the famous response at the Hampton Court Conference: no bishop, no king. James understood that episcopacy was intimately connected to royal authority. Bishops, appointed by the king, enforced royal religious policy and provided the crown with allies against potential opposition. A church governed by elected assemblies, as the Presbyterians wanted, would be much harder to control and might become a centre of resistance to royal power. James was willing to make some concessions to the Puritans. The King James Bible was one outcome of Hampton Court, but he would not compromise on the fundamental structure of church governance. This set the stage for decades of religious conflict that would intertwine with constitutional conflict in explosive ways. The Puritans were not just religious reformers, they were increasingly represented in Parliament, especially in the House of Commons, where the commercial classes who sympathised with Puritan views held considerable influence. When Parliament clashed with the king over money or politics, it was often the Puritan members who were most vociferous in their opposition. And when the king clashed with Parliament, he was often defending religious practices that Puritans considered unacceptable. Religion and politics were not separate spheres in the 17th century. They were woven together so tightly that pulling on one thread inevitably affected the other. The Scottish roots of the Stuart dynasty manifested in other ways as well. Scotland was a poorer kingdom than England, with a harsher climate, less fertile land, and fewer resources. The Scottish nobility lived harder lives than their English counterparts, their castles more often functional fortresses than comfortable country houses. This bred a certain toughness, an ability to endure hardship and make do with less, that contrasted with the relative luxury of English aristocratic life. But it also bred habits of violence and feuding that seemed primitive to English eyes. Scottish politics involved assassination and armed conflict more readily than English politics, where disputes were more often settled through legal manoeuvring and court intrigue. James himself had survived multiple plots against his life in Scotland, including one in which he was kidnapped by a faction of nobles and held prisoner for nearly a year. He had learned from these experiences to be suspicious, cautious, and always aware of potential threats. This wariness served him well in some respects. He managed to avoid the assassination that had claimed so many of his ancestors, but it also made him reluctant to trust and quick to see conspiracies where none existed. The Stuart tendency toward paranoia, which would reach extreme proportions in later generations, was already visible in James. The clan mentality of Scottish politics also influenced how James and his successors approached governance. In Scotland, power was personal, based on kinship ties and personal loyalty rather than abstract institutions. A Scottish king succeeded by building a network of reliable followers bound to him by bonds of blood, marriage, and mutual obligation. James attempted to replicate this system in England, showering favourites with lands, titles, and offices in an attempt to create a loyal faction that would support him against his enemies. This strategy worked to some extent. James did manage to build a court party that depended on royal patronage, but it also alienated those who were excluded and raised questions about whether the king was governing for the benefit of the realm or merely for the benefit of his friends. The most notorious example was Robert Carr, a handsome young Scotsman who caught James's eye and rose from obscurity to become Earl of Somerset, one of the most powerful men in England. James's affection for Carr was intense, and to many observers, embarrassing. The king's letters to his favourite read like love letters, and their physical intimacy was the subject of court gossip. Whether their relationship was sexual in the modern sense is impossible to know with certainty, but it was certainly closer than many thought proper for a king and a subject. When Carr became entangled in a murder scandal, his wife had poisoned a man who stood in the way of their marriage. James's reputation suffered along with his favourites. Carr was eventually replaced in James's affections by George Villiers, an even more ambitious favourite who would be created Duke of Buckingham and would dominate English politics for the next decade. Buckingham was charming, handsome, and completely unprincipled, willing to do whatever was necessary to maintain his position. James adored him, calling him Steenie, after St. Stephen, supposedly because Villiers had the face of an angel, and indulging his every whim. The relationship between the ageing king and his beautiful young favourite was uncomfortable for many to witness, and Buckingham's influence over policy was deeply resented by those who believed that government should be based on merit rather than royal affection. The English had not been entirely free of royal favourites. Elizabeth had her Leicester and her Essex, but James's favourites seemed to exercise a different kind of power. They were not just recipients of royal favour, they were gatekeepers who controlled access to the king and profited from selling that access to others. Corruption flourished under their protection, and the sense that the government was for sale deepened distrust between Crown and country. When Parliament eventually moved against Buckingham, impeaching him for corruption and incompetence, they were striking at the whole system of favouritism that the Stuarts had brought with them from Scotland. The religious, constitutional and personal conflicts of James's reign did not produce a crisis during his lifetime, but they created the conditions for the catastrophes that followed. James died in 1625, having ruled England for 22 years without provoking the kind of open confrontation that would destroy his son. He had managed this partly through luck, partly through political skill that he exercised more often than critics acknowledged, and partly through a willingness to compromise when absolutely necessary. He talked a good game about divine right, but in practice he often backed down when Parliament pushed back hard enough. This flexibility kept the peace, but it also meant that the fundamental questions about the relationship between king and Parliament remained unresolved, waiting for a less flexible monarch to bring them to a head. That monarch was Charles I, James's second son, who inherited the throne in 1625 along with all the problems his father had failed to solve and the favourite his father had loved. Charles was in many ways the opposite of his father. Where James was informal and verbose, Charles was stiff and reserved. Where James was intellectual and enjoyed debate, Charles was artistic and valued order and ceremony. Where James was willing to compromise, Charles viewed compromise as weakness. And where James had at least understood that he needed Parliament even if he resented it, Charles seemed to believe that he could rule without Parliament indefinitely, if only he asserted his divine right firmly enough. But Charles is a story for another chapter. For now, what matters is understanding the inheritance he received, not just the crown, but the constellation of problems that came with it. The Stuart dynasty arrived in England carrying the burden of their Scottish past, the executed mother whose memory could never be entirely escaped, the habits of clan loyalty and personal rule that did not fit the English system, the belief in divine right that Parliament was increasingly prepared to challenge. These were not insurmountable obstacles. A wiser, more flexible dynasty might have navigated them successfully, but the Stuarts were rarely wise and never flexible. They believed in their own righteousness with a conviction that brooked no opposition, and they paid for that conviction in blood. Mary Stuart's ghost haunted her descendants in ways they probably never fully appreciated. She had been a Catholic queen in a Protestant country, and her son and grandsons would all face suspicion of Catholic sympathies that complicated their reigns. She had claimed that monarchs answered only to God, and her descendants would repeat that claim until it cost one of them his head. She had been executed by order of Parliament, and her descendants would wage war against Parliament rather than accept its constraints. The curse of the Stuarts, if there was one, was not some mystical doom, but rather a set of ideas and attitudes passed down through generations, each one making the same mistakes, fighting the same battles, and refusing to learn from the disasters that had come before. The English who welcomed James in 1603 did not know that they were beginning a century of conflict that would transform their country beyond recognition. They saw only a Protestant king with a legitimate claim to the throne, and heirs to secure the succession, a blessed relief after the anxieties of Elizabeth's final years. They could not have imagined that within 50 years their king would be executed in public, their country would be ruled by a military dictator, and their constitution would be remade through violence and upheaval. The Stuart century was just beginning, and its bloodiest chapters were yet to come. The Scottish wolf had arrived on the English throne, and the sheep had no idea what was about to happen to them. What makes the Stuart tragedy so compelling is that it was not inevitable. At every stage, different choices could have led to different outcomes. James could have been more diplomatic with Parliament. Charles could have been less stubborn. The religious conflicts could have been managed with more tolerance and less insistence on uniformity. But the Stuarts were who they were, products of their Scottish upbringing, their family history, and their sincere belief that God had chosen them to rule. They could not become different people, and they could not see that the world was changing around them in ways that made their assumptions obsolete. The divine right of kings made sense in a world where everyone agreed that God ordered society hierarchically, and that monarchs were his appointed representatives. It made less sense in a world where men were beginning to question those assumptions and to imagine alternative ways of organising political power. The English Parliament that James faced in 1603 was not yet the revolutionary body it would become under Charles I. Its members were loyal subjects who wanted to work with their king, not against him. But they also had their own interests, their own beliefs, and their own sense of what the constitution permitted. When those interests conflicted with the king's, they expected negotiation and compromise, not lectures about divine authority. The failure of the Stuarts to understand this expectation, or rather, their understanding of it combined with their refusal to accept it, was the fundamental cause of everything that followed. It was a failure rooted in character, in history, and in the peculiar circumstances that brought a Scottish dynasty to the English throne. James I once said that kings are justly called gods, for they exercise a manner of resemblance of divine power upon earth. It was a remarkable claim, and he believed it sincerely. So did his son and his grandson and his great-grandson. They all believed they were special, chosen, set apart from ordinary mortals by the sacred oil of coronation and the blood of royal ancestors. And they were all wrong, in the sense that their subjects increasingly refused to accept this belief and were willing to fight against it. The Stuart tragedy was the tragedy of a family that could not adapt to a changing world, that held on to ideas whose time had passed, and that paid the ultimate price for their inflexibility. They were not villains. Most of them were sincere men who believed they were doing God's will, but they were catastrophically unsuited for the moment in history they inhabited. From the mists of Scotland to the scaffolds of England, the Stuart story is one of ambition and disaster, of crowns gained and heads lost, of a family convinced of its own divine mission, even as the evidence of its failure mounted around them. James VI of Scotland, James I of England, rode south in 1603, believing that God had finally rewarded his patience with the greatest prize in Christendom. He had no idea that he was leading his family into a century of chaos from which they would never recover. The son of the executed queen had become king of the executioners, and that bloody paradox would shape everything that followed. The curse of Mary Stuart, whatever it was, lived on in her descendants, driving them toward conflicts they could not win and doom they could not escape. When James rode south from Edinburgh to claim his English inheritance in 1603, he carried with him a vision that seemed, at first glance, perfectly sensible. Here was a man who now wore two crowns, one Scottish, one English, on the same head. The border that had divided these two kingdoms for centuries, that had been the site of countless raids, battles and blood feuds, suddenly seemed arbitrary. Why maintain the fiction of two separate nations when God had so obviously united them under one monarch? James believed that creating a single kingdom called Great Britain was not just politically wise, but divinely ordained. He was wrong about the divine part and spectacularly wrong about the politically wise part, but you had to admire his optimism. The idea of union was not entirely new. English kings had been trying to absorb Scotland for centuries, usually through the direct method of invasion, which had never worked particularly well. The Scots had a stubborn habit of refusing to be conquered, aided by difficult terrain, fierce fighters, and the tendency of English armies to run out of supplies before they could achieve anything decisive. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, had tried to pound Scotland into submission in the late 13th century, and had succeeded only in creating a national hero in William Wallace and a lasting tradition of Scottish resistance. His descendants had continued the effort with similarly disappointing results. Now James proposed to accomplish through paperwork what his predecessors had failed to achieve through warfare. He would simply merge the two kingdoms into one, create a common citizenship, harmonise the laws, and everyone would live happily ever after. The fact that nobody except James actually wanted this seemed like a minor obstacle. The English Parliament's reaction to James's grand vision can be summarised in one word: no. Actually, it was more like, no, absolutely not. Have you lost your mind? And by the way, we have some concerns about these Scottish courtiers you've brought with you. The English were not enthusiastic about sharing their relatively prosperous kingdom with their poorer northern neighbours. They worried about Scottish workers flooding south to take English jobs, a concern that would sound familiar to anyone following modern debates about immigration and labour markets. They worried about Scottish nobles gaining influence at court, which was already happening and would continue to happen regardless of formal union. They worried about their laws being changed, their church being altered, their entire way of life being disrupted by merger with a country they had spent centuries fighting. The economic arguments against union were particularly pointed. England was richer than Scotland by a considerable margin, with more fertile land, more trade, and more developed industries. If the two kingdoms merged, English critics argued, Scottish merchants would gain access to English markets and English colonial trade without having contributed to building them. Scottish labourers would migrate south seeking higher wages, driving down English wages in the process. Scotland would gain everything from union while England would gain nothing except the dubious pleasure of James's company, which they already had anyway. This was not entirely fair to Scotland. The Scots had their own economy, their own trade networks, and their own contributions to make, but fairness was not really the point. The point was that the English did not want to share, and no amount of royal enthusiasm was going to change their minds. The Scottish Parliament was hardly more cooperative, though for different reasons. The Scots worried not that they would be exploited, but that they would be ignored. In any united kingdom, Edinburgh would inevitably play second fiddle to London. The Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Church, and the Scottish legal system would all be subordinated to their English equivalents. Scotland would become, in effect, a province of England rather than a partner in a genuine union. The proud kingdom that had maintained its independence against English aggression for 300 years would simply disappear, absorbed into its larger neighbour like a small company being acquired by a corporate giant. The Scottish nobles who sat in Parliament had no intention of voting themselves into irrelevance, no matter how much their king wanted them to. James made the case for union with characteristic eloquence and characteristic tone-deafness. In his speeches to the English Parliament, he described himself as a husband married to both kingdoms, arguing that what God had joined together no man should put asunder. This matrimonial metaphor did not go over as well as James had hoped, partly because it raised awkward questions about bigamy, and partly because Parliament did not appreciate being compared to a wife who should simply obey her husband. James also pointed out that the union had already happened in his person. He was the living embodiment of British unity, the king in whom both nations were joined. Parliament responded, in effect, that while they were happy to have James as their king, they had not agreed to marry Scotland, and they were not going to start now. The negotiations dragged on for years, producing endless committees, reports, and proposals that went nowhere. A commission was appointed to discuss the terms of union, with representatives from both kingdoms meeting to hammer out details. They discussed citizenship, trade, legal harmonisation, and all the other technical questions that would need to be resolved. They produced recommendations that satisfied nobody. The English commissioners wanted to protect English interests. The Scottish commissioners wanted to protect Scottish interests, and nobody could figure out how to reconcile these competing demands. James grew increasingly frustrated with the slow pace of progress and the apparent bad faith of both sides. He had expected his subjects to share his enthusiasm for union, and he could not understand why they insisted on prioritising their narrow national interests over his grand vision. In the end, James got almost nothing of what he wanted. The most significant achievement was a ruling by English judges in Calvin's case of 1608, which established that Scots born after James's accession to the English throne were automatically English subjects as well. This meant that post-Union Scots, those born after 1603, could own land in England, sue in English courts, and enjoy the other privileges of English citizenship. Pre-Union Scots, those born before the magical date, remained aliens in English law, which created the absurd situation where a Scottish father might be a foreigner while his English-born son was a native. It was a typically British compromise, technically a step toward union, but practically a mess of exceptions, qualifications, and arbitrary distinctions. James continued to push for fuller union throughout his reign, but Parliament continued to resist, and eventually he had to accept that his dream would not be realised in his lifetime. He did, however, adopt the title King of Great Britain, and ordered that a new flag be designed combining the crosses of St. George and St. Andrew. This flag, the first Union Jack, was unpopular with both English and Scottish sailors, who objected to flying a foreign symbol alongside their own. The Scots complained that the English cross was placed on top of the Scottish cross, implying English superiority. The English complained about having to acknowledge Scotland at all. James solved this problem by simply ignoring the complaints and continuing to use his new flag, which set a precedent for how the British monarchy would handle Scottish grievances for the next several centuries. The failure of union was significant not because of what it prevented. England and Scotland would eventually merge in 1707, a century after James's attempt, but because of what it revealed about the limits of Stuart power. James had a vision, a plan, a sincere belief that he was doing God's work, and absolutely no ability to make it happen against the opposition of his subjects. Parliament had said no, and the king, for all his talk of divine right, had been forced to accept that no. This should have been a lesson for James and his successors about the realities of English governance. It was not. The Stuarts would continue to pursue grand visions that Parliament rejected, and they would continue to be surprised and offended when their subjects refused to cooperate. The Union fiasco was a preview of larger conflicts to come. James's failure also revealed the deep divisions within Britain that formal union might have papered over, but could not have resolved. The English and the Scots were genuinely different peoples with different histories, different institutions and different identities. They did not trust each other, did not particularly like each other, and had no desire to become one nation just because they happened to share a king. These divisions would persist long after James was gone, flaring up repeatedly in the conflicts of the 17th century, and continuing to simmer beneath the surface of British politics to this day. The Act of Union in 1707 would eventually create a united kingdom, but it would never create a united people. James's dream of Great Britain was noble in conception but naive in execution, and its failure was a fitting symbol for the Stuart dynasty as a whole. Grand ambitions colliding with stubborn realities, idealistic visions crashing against the rocks of human nature. But if union was merely a disappointment, religion was a catastrophe. The religious divisions that James inherited were far more dangerous than the political divisions between England and Scotland, and they would prove far more difficult to manage. James walked into a three-way conflict between Catholics, established Anglicans and Puritan reformers, each group convinced that God was on their side and that the others were servants of Satan. Finding a middle ground in this conflict was probably impossible. The different groups wanted incompatible things, but James did not help matters by promising more than he could deliver, and then failing to deliver even that. The Catholics had particular reason to hope that James would be sympathetic to their cause. His mother had been a Catholic martyr, executed for her faith by the Protestant Elizabeth. His wife, Anne of Denmark, had converted to Catholicism, though she kept this relatively quiet. During the last years of Elizabeth's reign, James had sent signals to Catholic powers suggesting that he might ease the persecution of English Catholics if he became king. These signals were probably just diplomatic manoeuvring. James was trying to secure support for his succession from as many quarters as possible, but the Catholics took them seriously. They expected that the son of Mary Stuart would finally give them the relief they had been seeking for decades. They were wrong. James had no intention of restoring Catholicism, or even of tolerating it openly. He was a Protestant, raised by Protestant tutors, committed to the Protestant Church, and well aware that any move toward Catholicism would provoke a massive backlash from the Protestant majority of his subjects. The hints he had dropped before becoming king were quietly forgotten, and the penal laws against Catholics remained in force. Catholics were still required to pay fines for not attending Anglican services. Catholic priests were still subject to execution if caught. Catholic families were still barred from holding office, attending universities, and practicing their faith openly. The discrimination was less severe than it had been under Elizabeth. James was not particularly interested in making martyrs, but it was still discrimination, and the Catholics who had hoped for better were bitterly disappointed. This disappointment led, in some quarters, to desperation. If the new king would not grant Catholics relief through legitimate means, perhaps he could be persuaded through other methods. Or perhaps he could be removed entirely and replaced with a more cooperative monarch. The most famous expression of this desperate thinking was the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, a conspiracy that has become one of the most enduring stories in English history, commemorated every November 5th with bonfires and fireworks. The story is so well known that it has almost become a cliché, but it is worth examining in detail because it reveals just how explosive the religious tensions of James's reign really were. The plot was the brainchild of Robert Catesby, a charismatic Catholic gentleman who had been involved in various anti-government conspiracies for years. Catesby was frustrated by the failure of peaceful methods to achieve Catholic emancipation, and had concluded that only dramatic action could change the situation. His plan was breathtakingly ambitious. He would blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament, killing the king, the royal family, and most of the Protestant nobility in one spectacular explosion. In the chaos that followed, Catholic forces would seize control of the government and restore England to the true faith. It was the kind of plan that sounds almost reasonable when you're sitting around with like-minded friends after several drinks, and completely insane when you actually think about the logistics. Catesby recruited a small group of fellow Catholic conspirators, including Thomas Percy, Thomas Wintour, and the man who would become most famous of all, Guy Fawkes. Fawkes was a soldier who had spent years fighting for Catholic Spain in the Netherlands and had experience with explosives. His job was to manage the technical aspects of the plot, acquiring the gunpowder, placing it in position, and lighting the fuse at the right moment. The conspirators rented a cellar beneath the House of Lords and gradually smuggled in 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough to reduce the building and everyone in it to rubble. By early November 1605, everything was in place. All that remained was to wait for Parliament to open. Then someone talked. On the night of October 26th, a Catholic lord named William Parker, Baron Monteagle, received an anonymous letter warning him to stay away from the opening of Parliament. The letter was vague about the specific threat, but clear that something terrible was going to happen, and that Monteagle should find an excuse to be elsewhere. Monteagle, instead of quietly taking the hint, showed the letter to Robert Cecil, the King's chief minister. Cecil was one of the most capable spy masters in English history, and he immediately recognised that he had stumbled onto something significant. He showed the letter to James, and the King, displaying an unexpected flair for detective work, deduced that the threat involved some kind of explosion from below. On the night of November 4th, the authorities searched the cellars beneath Parliament and discovered Guy Fawkes standing guard over the barrels of gunpowder, wearing a cloak and carrying a watch and matches. Fawkes was arrested on the spot, and under torture, the kind of rigorous interrogation that the 17th century specialised in, he revealed the names of his co-conspirators. The other plotters fled London and made a desperate stand at Holbeach House in Staffordshire, where most of them were killed or captured. Catesby died in the fighting, which saved him from the particularly unpleasant fate that awaited the survivors. Those who were taken alive were tried for treason and executed by hanging, drawing and quartering, a punishment so gruesome that even hardened observers found it difficult to watch. The failure of the gunpowder plot was a disaster for English Catholics, and not just for those directly involved. The entire Catholic community fell under suspicion of disloyalty, and the penal laws were tightened significantly in the years that followed. Catholics were now required to take an oath of allegiance that repudiated the Pope's authority to depose kings, an oath that many Catholics found impossible to swear in good conscience. New restrictions were placed on where Catholics could live, what professions they could practice, and how they could educate their children. The brief hope that James might ease their persecution had turned into a nightmare of intensified discrimination. It would take more than 2 centuries for English Catholics to regain the civil rights they lost in the aftermath of the gunpowder plot. The plot also became a propaganda gift for the Protestant establishment. Every year on November 5th, the English celebrated their deliverance from Catholic terrorism with bonfires, fireworks, and the burning of effigies. The anniversary kept alive the memory of Catholic treachery and reinforced the message that Catholicism was incompatible with English liberty. Guy Fawkes became a symbol of Catholic villainy, his name synonymous with treason and conspiracy. The fact that he was just one member of a small group of extremists, and that the vast majority of English Catholics had nothing to do with the plot, was conveniently forgotten. The gunpowder plot became part of the mythology of Protestant England, a story that justified continued discrimination against Catholics and kept the fires of religious hatred burning for generations. But if the Catholics were now firmly established as enemies of the state, the Puritans presented a different kind of problem. They were not trying to blow up Parliament or assassinate the king. They were trying to reform the Church of England from within, and they were doing it through entirely legal means that James found almost as annoying as gunpowder plots. The Puritans wanted to purify the Church of its remaining Catholic elements, the vestments, the ceremonies, the hierarchical structure that seemed to them too much like the Church of Rome they had rejected. They wanted simpler services, more preaching, stricter morality, and above all they wanted bishops gone. The episcopal system, in which bishops appointed by the king governed the church, was in their view an unbiblical corruption that needed to be replaced with a system of elected elders governing themselves. James's response to Puritan demands was shaped by his Scottish experience. He had spent his entire life fighting with Presbyterian ministers who believed they had the right to lecture the king about his duties to God. John Knox's successors were just as fierce as the original, and they had made James's reign in Scotland a constant battle over who really controlled the church. James had come to hate Presbyterian church government with a passion that went beyond mere political calculation. No bishop, no king, he told the Puritans at the Hampton Court Conference in 1604, meaning that if you got rid of bishops, you would eventually get rid of kings as well. Episcopal government and royal government were linked in James's mind. Challenge one, and you challenge the other. The Hampton Court Conference was supposed to be a grand reconciliation between the king and the Puritan faction. James summoned representatives of both the established church and the Puritan reformers to discuss their differences and find common ground. In practice, it was more of a lecture than a discussion, with James explaining to the Puritans why they were wrong about nearly everything. He did make a few concessions. He agreed to a new translation of the Bible, which would become the famous King James Version, and he accepted some minor reforms in church practice. But on the fundamental question of church government, he would not budge. Bishops would remain, appointed by the Crown and accountable to the Crown, and the Puritans would have to live with it. Many Puritans did live with it, grumbling but compliant, working within the system to promote their version of Protestantism. But others found the situation intolerable. If England would not reform its church properly, perhaps they needed to find somewhere else where they could worship as they believed God intended. This impulse led to the Pilgrim Fathers, a group of religious separatists who first fled to the Netherlands and then, in 1620, sailed to America on the Mayflower to establish a colony where they could practice their faith without interference. The Massachusetts Bay Colony followed in 1630, founded by Puritans who wanted to create a model Christian society that would shame England into reformation. The religious conflicts of James's reign were thus exporting themselves across the Atlantic, planting seeds of Puritan culture in North America that would have profound consequences for centuries to come. Those who stayed in England continued to push for reform, and their numbers were growing. Puritanism was particularly strong among the merchant classes and the gentry of southern and eastern England, precisely the groups that were well represented in the House of Commons. As the 17th century progressed, Parliament became increasingly Puritan in its sympathies, which meant that conflicts between king and Parliament often had a religious dimension, as well as a constitutional one. When members of Parliament objected to royal policies, they were often objecting not just to the specific policy, but to what they perceived as a drift toward Catholicism or Catholic-style worship. The king's religious preferences and Parliament's religious preferences were moving in opposite directions, and this divergence would eventually contribute to the catastrophic breakdown of relations under Charles I. James managed to avoid the worst consequences of religious conflict through a combination of luck, flexibility, and the sheer good fortune of dying before things got really bad. He maintained a church that was Protestant enough to satisfy most of his subjects, while retaining enough traditional elements to keep the more conservative Anglicans happy. He persecuted Catholics enough to maintain his Protestant credentials without provoking another gunpowder plot. He resisted Puritan demands for further reformation, while making enough minor concessions to keep the reformers from open rebellion. It was a balancing act that required constant attention and occasional retreat, and it left nobody fully satisfied, but it kept the peace for 2 decades. The peace, however, was fragile. The fundamental disagreements about religion, about what kind of church England should have, about how much power the monarch should have over religious affairs, about whether Catholics were dangerous traitors or persecuted victims, remained unresolved. James had managed these disagreements, he had not settled them. His son Charles would inherit a religious situation that was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The Catholics were still discriminated against and still resented it. The Puritans were still pushing for reform and still being told no. The established church was still defending its bishops and ceremonies against attacks from both sides. All that was needed was a king less flexible than James, less willing to compromise, more committed to imposing his own religious vision, and Charles was exactly that kind of king. The religious conflicts of James's reign also revealed something important about the nature of Stuart monarchy. James genuinely believed that religious uniformity was necessary for political stability, that a kingdom divided by religion could not stand. This was not an unreasonable belief in the context of the 17th century. The wars of religion in France and the 30 Years' War in Germany demonstrated how devastating religious conflict could be. But James's solution to religious division was top-down uniformity imposed by royal authority. The king would decide what the national church looked like, and everyone would conform to that decision. This approach assumed that the king had the right and the power to make such decisions, an assumption that many of his subjects were beginning to question. The Puritans, in particular, had a very different understanding of religious authority. They believed that the Bible was the ultimate authority in religious matters, not the king, and that believers had the right, indeed the duty, to interpret Scripture for themselves. If the king's church conflicted with biblical truth, then believers were obligated to follow the Bible rather than the king. This was a revolutionary idea, though the Puritans would have been horrified to hear it described that way. They were not trying to overthrow the king or challenge royal authority in secular matters. They just wanted to worship God correctly, according to their understanding of Scripture. But in a world where religion and politics were inseparable, challenging the king's religious authority inevitably raised questions about his political authority as well. James understood this connection, which is why he fought so hard to maintain Episcopal church government and why he was so hostile to Puritan demands for reform. No bishop, no king was not just a slogan. It was a genuine insight into the relationship between religious and political power in early modern England. If the church was governed by elected assemblies rather than appointed bishops, then the principle of hierarchy and appointed authority was undermined. If believers could interpret Scripture for themselves and challenge the official church, then subjects might start interpreting law for themselves and challenging the official government. The Puritan challenge to bishops was, in James's view, the thin end of a wedge that would eventually pry apart the entire structure of royal authority. History would prove James right about the connection between religious and political radicalism, though not quite in the way he imagined. The civil war that would tear England apart in the 1640s would be fought partly over religious issues, the nature of the church, the role of bishops, the limits of royal authority in religious matters. The most radical elements of the parliamentary side would indeed move from challenging bishops to challenging kings, from religious reformation to political revolution. The execution of Charles I in 1649 would be justified partly in religious terms, as the judgment of God against a tyrannical monarch. James's fears about where Puritan ideas might lead were not paranoid fantasies. They were accurate predictions of what would actually happen, just not in his lifetime. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In 1625, when James died after 22 years on the English throne, the catastrophe was still in the future. James had not solved the religious problems of his kingdom, but he had managed them well enough to avoid disaster. He left his son a difficult inheritance: Catholics who felt persecuted, Puritans who felt ignored, a church that satisfied nobody completely, but it was not yet an impossible inheritance. Charles could still have navigated these conflicts if he had possessed his father's flexibility and political instincts. He did not possess those qualities. He possessed instead a rigid certainty about his own rightness that made compromise feel like weakness and negotiation feel like surrender. The religious powder keg that James had kept from exploding would finally ignite under Charles, with consequences that neither father nor son could have imagined. The story of religion under James is thus a story of problems deferred rather than solved, of conflicts managed rather than resolved, of a brief period of relative stability before the storm. James's achievement was not insignificant. Keeping the peace in a religiously divided society for 2 decades was no small accomplishment, but it was also incomplete. The fundamental questions about religious authority, about the relationship between church and state, about the rights of conscience and the limits of conformity, remained open. They would be answered eventually, but the answers would be written in blood. The gunpowder plot and its aftermath cast a long shadow over the rest of James's reign and beyond. Every November 5th, the English were reminded that Catholics had tried to destroy their government, their king, and their way of life. This annual commemoration kept alive the fear and hatred of Catholicism that had been such a feature of Elizabethan England and that would continue to shape English politics for centuries. The penal laws against Catholics remained in force, creating a permanent underclass of second-class subjects who could not fully participate in national life. The division between Protestant and Catholic, which the Reformation had created, was now embedded in English law and English culture in ways that would take generations to undo. At the same time, the Puritan challenge continued to grow. The reformers who had been disappointed at Hampton Court did not give up. They regrouped, organised, and waited for better opportunities. They built networks of like-minded believers in parishes across the country. They educated their children in Puritan principles and sent them to universities where Puritan ideas were influential. They elected Puritan members to Parliament and supported Puritan preachers in their livings. By the time Charles I came to the throne, Puritanism was not a fringe movement but a significant force in English religious life, represented in the church, in Parliament, and in the broader culture. The conflict between this growing movement and a king determined to impose his own religious vision would be one of the central dramas of the next reign. James himself seems to have understood that he was leaving unfinished business. In his later years, he grew more pessimistic about the prospects for religious peace, warning his son about the dangers of both Catholic plots and Puritan agitation. He advised Charles to maintain the established church as he had received it, to avoid innovations that might provoke conflict, and to be wary of extremism on both sides. Charles would ignore most of this advice, pursuing religious policies that his father would have considered reckless. The disaster that followed was not James's fault. He had done what he could with the materials he had, but it was the consequence of problems that James had been unable to solve. The religious conflicts of early Stuart England are sometimes difficult for modern readers to understand. We live in a world where religion is largely a private matter, where people of different faiths can live side by side without much friction, where the idea of killing someone over theological disagreements seems barbaric. The 17th century was different. Religion was not private. It was the foundation of social order, the basis of political legitimacy, the framework through which people understood their place in the universe. To challenge someone's religion was to challenge their entire worldview, their identity, their understanding of right and wrong. Religious differences were not mere disagreements, they were existential threats. This intensity explains why the religious conflicts of the Stuart era were so bitter and so destructive. The Catholics who plotted to blow up Parliament genuinely believed they were fighting for the salvation of souls. The Puritans who demanded church reform genuinely believed they were obeying God's commands. The established church that defended bishops and ceremonies genuinely believed it was preserving true Christian worship. Everyone was sincere, everyone was convinced of their own righteousness, and everyone was willing to fight for their beliefs. In such circumstances, compromise was difficult and peace was precarious. The remarkable thing is not that religious war eventually came to England, but that it was delayed as long as it was. James I deserves some credit for that delay. He was not a tolerant man in the modern sense. He persecuted Catholics and harassed Puritans like any good Protestant monarch of his era. But he was a pragmatic man who preferred peace to conflict and survival to martyrdom. He understood that his kingdom contained people of different religious views, and that forcing everyone into conformity was probably impossible, and certainly dangerous. His policy of cautious moderation, of suppression without extermination, of resistance without rigidity, kept the lid on religious tensions for 2 decades. It was not a solution, but it was management, and sometimes management is the best you can do. The dream of Great Britain and the nightmare of religious conflict were thus the twin themes of James's reign, and both would echo through the reigns of his successors. The union that James failed to achieve would eventually come about, though not in the way he imagined and not without considerable conflict along the way. The religious peace that James maintained would collapse into civil war, with consequences that would reshape English society from top to bottom. James planted seeds during his reign, some intentionally and some not, that would bear bitter fruit in the years to come. The Scottish wolf on the English throne had done his best, but his best was not enough to prevent the catastrophe that was approaching. The Stuart century was just beginning, and the worst was yet to come. Every king needs advisors. This is one of those statements that sounds obvious until you start thinking about what it actually means in practice. A monarch, even one who believes his authority comes directly from God, cannot personally manage every aspect of government. Someone has to handle the paperwork, negotiate with foreign powers, manage the treasury, command the armies, and deal with the 1,000 daily decisions that keep a kingdom running. The question is not whether a king will have powerful advisors, but who those advisors will be, how they will gain their influence, and what will happen when that influence becomes a problem. For the Stuarts, this question had particularly dramatic answers. The favourites who stood behind Stuart thrones wielded extraordinary power, attracted extraordinary hatred, and often met extraordinary ends. Their stories are inseparable from the stories of the kings they served, and in some cases they are more interesting. The most famous, or infamous, of Stuart favourites was George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, whose career spans the reigns of both James I and Charles I, and whose influence on English history was almost entirely catastrophic. Villiers was born in 1692 to a family of minor Leicestershire gentry, the kind of background that would normally doom a man to provincial obscurity. He had no great wealth, no powerful connections, no particular qualifications for high office. What he had was extraordinary physical beauty, natural charm, and an ability to make himself indispensable to those in power. These qualities would carry him from country gentleman to the most powerful man in England in less than a decade, a rise so improbable that even contemporaries found it astonishing. Villiers first came to court in 1614 at the age of 22, as part of a deliberate scheme by enemies of the existing royal favourite, Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset. Somerset had dominated James's affections for years, but he was becoming a liability. His wife had just been exposed as a murderer, and the scandal threatened to engulf the king himself. The anti-Somerset faction needed a replacement, someone beautiful and charming enough to capture James's attention and displace the disgraced favourite. Villiers fit the bill perfectly. He was presented to the king at a carefully staged encounter, and James was immediately smitten. Within months, Somerset was out and Villiers was in, beginning an ascent that would make him the most hated man in England. The nature of James's relationship with Villiers has been debated for centuries. James showered his new favourite with gifts, titles and endearments that went far beyond normal royal patronage. He called Villiers Steenie, supposedly because he resembled the angels in paintings of St. Stephen. He wrote letters that read like love letters, full of affectionate nicknames and protestations of devotion. He created Villiers Viscount, then Earl, then Marquess, and finally Duke of Buckingham, the first non-royal duke created in England for over a century. Whether this relationship was sexual in the physical sense is impossible to know with certainty. 17th century categories of sexuality do not map neatly onto modern ones, and the evidence is ambiguous. What is certain is that James's feelings for Buckingham were intense, possessive and all-consuming, and that Buckingham exploited these feelings ruthlessly for his own advancement. Buckingham's rise was meteoric even by the standards of royal favourites. By 1619, he was effectively running English foreign policy, despite having no experience in diplomacy and no particular aptitude for it. By 1620, he was Lord High Admiral, commander of the English Navy, a position for which his qualifications were similarly non-existent. He controlled access to the king, which meant that anyone who wanted royal favour had to go through him first, and pay for the privilege. Offices were sold, monopolies were granted, and the wheels of corruption turned smoothly under Buckingham's management. He was not the first favourite to profit from his position, but he did so on a scale that made his predecessors look like amateurs. The problem with Buckingham was not just that he was corrupt. Corruption was almost expected in 17th century government, but that he was incompetent at the things that actually mattered. His management of foreign policy was a series of expensive disasters. He pushed for war with Spain, then bungled the military expeditions so badly that they achieved nothing except wasting money and lives. He negotiated a marriage between Prince Charles and the French Princess Henrietta Maria, then immediately picked a fight with France that made the alliance worthless. His naval expeditions were fiascos, ships that were not seaworthy, supplies that did not arrive, soldiers who died of disease before they could fight. By the mid-1620s, Buckingham had managed to get England into wars with both Spain and France simultaneously, while possessing neither the money nor the military capacity to win either conflict. This was an impressive achievement in its own way, though not the kind anyone would want on their resume. Parliament hated Buckingham with a passion that intensified with each passing year. Members saw him as the source of everything wrong with royal government: the corruption, the failed policies, the endless demands for money to fund wars that went nowhere. They attempted to impeach him in 1626, charging him with corruption, incompetence, and practically everything else they could think of. Charles I, who had inherited both the throne and the favourite from his father, responded by dissolving Parliament before the impeachment could proceed. This established a pattern that would characterise Charles's reign. Whenever Parliament tried to hold his ministers accountable, Charles would protect them by shutting down Parliament entirely. It was not a sustainable approach to governance, but Charles was not thinking about sustainability. He was thinking about loyalty, and Buckingham was his friend. The relationship between Charles and Buckingham was different from the relationship between James and Buckingham, but no less intense. Charles had grown up in Buckingham's shadow, overshadowed by his more charismatic older brother Henry, until Henry's death in 1612. The young Charles was shy, stammering, physically awkward, everything that Buckingham was not. Yet somehow the two became close friends, bonded by a shared adventure in 1623 when they travelled incognito to Spain in a harebrained scheme to woo the Spanish Infanta. The scheme failed spectacularly, but it cemented a friendship that would last until Buckingham's death. Charles trusted Buckingham implicitly, defended him against all critics, and relied on his advice in matters where Buckingham had no business advising anyone. The assassination of Buckingham in August 1628 was one of those events that everyone claimed to deplore but few genuinely mourned. The assassin was John Felton, a disgruntled army officer who had been wounded in one of Buckingham's failed military expeditions, and blamed the Duke for his subsequent poverty and neglect. Felton bought a cheap knife in a London shop, travelled to Portsmouth where Buckingham was preparing yet another naval expedition, and stabbed the Duke through the heart in a crowded room. The killing was so quick that bystanders initially did not realise what had happened. Buckingham pulled the knife from his own chest, staggered a few steps, and collapsed dead. His last word was reportedly villain, whether addressed to Felton or to fate in general no one knew. Felton was arrested immediately and became, to his apparent surprise, something of a popular hero. Londoners drank toasts to his health, poets wrote verses praising his deed, people openly celebrated the death of a man they had hated for years. Charles was devastated, locking himself in his room to grieve while his subjects rejoiced. The contrast between royal sorrow and public celebration revealed just how far the crown had drifted from popular sentiment. Buckingham's death removed the immediate focus of parliamentary anger, but it did not solve the underlying problems. Charles would continue to rule in ways that antagonised Parliament, continue to demand money for wars that Parliament did not support, continue to protect favourites from accountability. The conflicts that Buckingham had exacerbated would persist long after he was gone. Buckingham's legacy was almost entirely negative. He had enriched himself and his family at public expense, pursued foreign policies that damaged English interests, and poisoned relations between Crown and Parliament at a critical moment. Yet in a strange way, his very incompetence made him valuable to historians trying to understand what went wrong with Stuart government. Buckingham was not an evil genius manipulating events from the shadows. He was an ambitious mediocrity who happened to catch the eye of two kings and rode that advantage as far as it would go. The system that allowed someone like Buckingham to accumulate so much power with so little qualification was the real problem. The Stuarts governed through personal relationships rather than institutional processes, which meant that personal favourites could wield enormous influence regardless of their abilities. This was a recipe for exactly the kind of disaster that Buckingham delivered. The next great Stuart favourite was Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, whose career followed a different trajectory but ended in the same place: violent death as a result of parliamentary hatred. Wentworth was everything Buckingham was not: competent, experienced, genuinely talented at administration. He had been a member of Parliament himself, initially critical of royal policies and supportive of parliamentary rights. Then, in 1628, he switched sides, accepting office under Charles I and becoming one of the king's most effective and most feared servants. His former parliamentary allies never forgave this betrayal, and they would eventually have their revenge. Wentworth's great project was Ireland, where he served as Lord Deputy from 1633 to 1639. His task was to make Ireland profitable for the Crown and obedient to royal authority, goals that had eluded English administrators for centuries. Wentworth pursued these goals with a ruthlessness that earned him the nickname Black Tom Tyrant. He broke the power of the Old English Catholic aristocracy, confiscated lands, manipulated the Irish Parliament, and generally behaved as though the normal rules of law and custom did not apply to him. The results were impressive in a narrow sense. Ireland under Wentworth generated more revenue and caused fewer problems than it had in generations. But the methods created deep resentments that would explode in the Irish Rebellion of 1641, just 2 years after Wentworth's departure. Charles recalled Wentworth from Ireland in 1639 to deal with a crisis in Scotland, where resistance to royal religious policies had erupted into open rebellion. The Scots had rejected Charles's attempt to impose a new prayer book on the Scottish Church, and they had formed a covenant to defend their Presbyterian religion against royal interference. Charles needed an army to suppress the rebellion, and he needed money to pay for that army. This meant calling Parliament for the first time in 11 years, the so-called Long Parliament that would eventually put the king himself on trial. Wentworth, newly created Earl of Strafford, became Charles's chief minister and the lightning rod for parliamentary fury. Parliament moved against Strafford almost immediately, impeaching him for treason in November 1640. The charges were somewhat creative, since Strafford had not actually committed treason in any conventional sense. He had served the king zealously and effectively, which was his job. But Parliament was determined to destroy him, both as revenge for his betrayal and as a warning to other potential royal servants. When the impeachment seemed likely to fail on technical legal grounds, Parliament switched tactics and passed a Bill of Attainder instead, a legislative act that simply declared Strafford guilty without need for trial or evidence. It was legal thuggery, but it was effective. Charles faced an agonizing choice. Strafford had served him loyally and well. Abandoning him to Parliament would be a betrayal of everything Charles believed about the relationship between king and servant. But London was in uproar. Mobs were threatening the royal family, and Parliament made clear that nothing else would be accomplished until Strafford was dealt with. Charles's own bishops advised him that he could sacrifice one man to save the kingdom without violating his conscience. After days of anguish, Charles signed the death warrant, reportedly saying, "My Lord of Strafford's condition is happier than mine." It was not one of his finer moments, and Charles would later regard it as the worst decision of his life, the sin for which God was punishing him when his own head fell to the executioner's axe. Strafford was beheaded on Tower Hill in May 1641 before a crowd of over 100,000 spectators who had come to watch the hated minister die. His last words included a haunting observation that would prove prophetic: "Put not your trust in princes." Charles had indeed proven untrustworthy, sacrificing his most capable servant to appease a parliament that would not be appeased. Strafford's death did not save Charles or prevent the coming war. It merely demonstrated that the king could be pressured into abandoning his allies, a lesson that would embolden his enemies and demoralize his friends. The execution was the beginning of the end for Charles's personal rule, the first in a series of concessions that would eventually strip him of power and then of life. The third great Stuart favourite was Edward Hyde, Earl of Clarendon, who served Charles II during the Restoration and exemplified a different kind of favouritism, the favourite who outlives his usefulness. Hyde had been a loyal royalist throughout the Civil War and the Interregnum, sharing the exiled Charles's poverty and hopelessness during the long years of Cromwellian rule. When Charles was restored to the throne in 1660, Hyde was rewarded with the highest offices: Lord Chancellor, Chief Minister, and eventually an earldom. His daughter Anne had secretly married Charles's brother James, which made Hyde the grandfather of future monarchs. He seemed to have achieved everything a royal favourite could hope for. But Hyde was old-fashioned in ways that did not suit the Restoration court. He was serious, moralistic, and disapproving of the sexual licence that characterised Charles II's reign. He had little patience for the king's mistresses and less for the corruption that flourished under royal patronage. He was also closely identified with policies that became increasingly unpopular: the sale of Dunkirk to France, the disasters of the Second Anglo-Dutch War, and various financial scandals that were not actually his fault, but for which he received the blame. By 1667, Hyde had become a liability, too closely associated with failure, too useful as a scapegoat, too irritating to a king who preferred sycophants to honest advisers. Charles dismissed Hyde in August 1667 and allowed Parliament to begin impeachment proceedings. Hyde, reading the situation accurately, fled to France rather than face trial. He spent his remaining years in exile writing a massive history of the Civil War that remains one of the most important sources for the period. He died in 1674, never having returned to England or recovered his position. His fall demonstrated that even long service and family connections were no protection when a king decided that a favourite had become inconvenient. Charles II, unlike his father, was willing to sacrifice his ministers without much anguish. He had learned from Strafford's fate that sentiment was a luxury kings could not afford. The pattern that emerges from these stories is one of mutual exploitation and mutual destruction. Kings used favourites to govern, to absorb criticism, and to do the dirty work that monarchs preferred not to do themselves. Favourites used kings to acquire wealth, power, and status that their birth and talents would never have earned them on their own. The relationship worked as long as the favourite remained useful, and the king remained willing to protect him. It collapsed when circumstances changed, and the favourite became a liability rather than an asset. The favourites of the Stuart era were not shadowy puppet masters controlling weak-willed monarchs. They were servants who happened to be in the right place at the right time, and who rose and fell according to the shifting winds of royal favour and political necessity. What made Stuart favourites particularly problematic was the constitutional context in which they operated. Parliament was increasingly assertive about its right to hold the king's ministers accountable, to investigate their conduct and punish their failures. The king was equally assertive about his right to choose his own advisers and protect them from parliamentary interference. Every clash over a favourite was also a clash over these competing claims to authority. Buckingham's impeachment was not just about Buckingham. It was about whether Parliament could remove a minister the king wanted to keep. Strafford's attainder was not just about Strafford. It was about whether Parliament could override royal prerogative through legislative action. The favourites were pawns in a larger game, though they were pawns who suffered real consequences when the game turned against them. But the men who stood behind Stuart thrones were only half the story. The women who stood beside them, wives, mothers, daughters, exercised their own forms of influence, often more subtle but no less significant. The Stuart queens and princesses rarely held formal power, but they shaped events through their relationships, their children, and their ability to influence the men who did hold power. Their stories are intertwined with the stories of the favourites, forming a complex web of personal relationships that drove political outcomes in ways that official documents rarely capture. The most consequential of Stuart queens was Henrietta Maria, the French princess who became the wife of Charles I and the mother of two future kings. Her marriage to Charles in 1625 was supposed to be a diplomatic triumph, cementing an alliance between England and France against their common enemy Spain. Instead, it became a source of endless controversy, religious suspicion, and political disaster. Henrietta Maria was a devout Catholic in a country that had spent a century defining itself against Catholicism. This was not a recipe for domestic harmony. The marriage began badly. Henrietta Maria was only 15 when she arrived in England, young and homesick and surrounded by a French household that English courtiers resented. Charles, still grieving for Buckingham and struggling with the responsibilities of kingship, had little patience for a teenage bride who did not speak English well and who refused to participate in Protestant religious ceremonies. The couple quarrelled constantly in the early years, with Charles eventually expelling most of Henrietta Maria's French attendants in a fit of frustration. It was not an auspicious start. Yet somehow, after Buckingham's assassination removed the man who had dominated Charles's affections, the royal marriage improved dramatically. Charles and Henrietta Maria developed a genuine love for each other, a domestic happiness that was unusual among royal couples of the era. They had 9 children, of whom 6 survived infancy, a reasonable record by 17th century standards. Charles was faithful to his wife, which was decidedly not reasonable by 17th century standards. Unlike his son Charles II, he kept no mistresses and showed no interest in the sexual adventures that were expected of kings. The royal family became a model of domestic virtue, a sharp contrast to the corruption and immorality that critics saw in the rest of the court. But Henrietta Maria's Catholicism remained a permanent scandal. She heard Mass daily, maintained a chapel with Catholic priests, and made no secret of her hope that England might someday return to the true faith. Her enemies, and she had many, accused her of secretly converting the king, of plotting with foreign Catholic powers, of using her influence to undermine the Protestant establishment. None of these accusations were entirely fair. Charles remained a committed Anglican throughout his life, and Henrietta Maria's political influence, while real, was not as sinister as her critics claimed. But perception mattered more than reality. The presence of a Catholic queen at the heart of the English court fed Protestant anxieties and provided ammunition for those who wanted to portray the king as insufficiently committed to the Reformation. When civil war came, Henrietta Maria threw herself into the royalist cause with a passion that both helped and hindered her husband. She travelled to the Netherlands to pawn the crown jewels and raise money for the king's army. She smuggled weapons and supplies into England at considerable personal risk. She encouraged Charles to resist parliamentary demands and to trust in God's eventual vindication of the royal cause. Her energy and determination were impressive. Her political judgment was not. She pushed Charles toward confrontation when compromise might have been possible, reinforced his belief in his own righteousness when doubt might have been healthier, and generally contributed to the inflexibility that would prove fatal. After Charles's execution, Henrietta Maria lived in exile in France, poor and increasingly forgotten, a widow in a foreign court that had its own problems and little attention to spare for dispossessed English queens. She returned briefly to England after the Restoration, but she was old and ill and out of place in the frivolous court of her son Charles II. She died in France in 1669, having outlived her husband by 20 years and having seen her sons restored to the throne she had fought to defend. Her legacy was mixed, a woman of genuine courage and devotion who was also genuinely damaging to the causes she championed. The hatred she attracted during her lifetime was excessive and often unfair, but it was not entirely without basis. She was a symbol of everything Protestant England feared, and she did little to reassure those fears. The next Stuart queen, Catherine of Braganza, wife of Charles II, was a different kind of Catholic consort, quieter, less politically engaged, and ultimately less consequential. Catherine was a Portuguese princess whose dowry included the ports of Tangier and Bombay, valuable acquisitions that helped justify a marriage that otherwise produced no children, and considerable awkwardness. Charles was never faithful to Catherine, flaunting his mistresses openly and fathering numerous illegitimate children while his wife remained barren. Catherine endured these humiliations with dignity, developing a genuine affection for her wayward husband that he seems to have returned in his own careless way. Catherine's Catholicism was less threatening than Henrietta Maria's had been, partly because Catherine was less assertive, and partly because Charles II's court was so generally dissolute that religious concerns seemed almost quaint. The real religious anxiety during Charles II's reign focused not on the Queen but on the King's brother James, whose conversion to Catholicism in the early 1670s raised the terrifying prospect of a Catholic succession. James's first wife, Anne Hyde, had also converted before her death in 1671, and their children were being raised as Catholics. When the Popish plot hysteria swept England in 1678, the targets were James and his circle, not the inoffensive Catherine. She survived the reign and the Glorious Revolution, eventually returning to Portugal where she served as regent for her brother. Her story is one of quiet endurance rather than dramatic intervention, a contrast to the more turbulent careers of other Stuart queens. The woman who triggered the final crisis of Stuart rule was Mary of Modena, the second wife of James II, whose pregnancy in 1687 set in motion the events that would end the dynasty's hold on the throne. Mary was Italian, young, beautiful, and Catholic, the last quality being the only one that really mattered politically. James had married her in 1673, and the marriage had produced several children who all died in infancy. By the mid-1680s it seemed unlikely that Mary would bear a surviving heir, which meant that the succession would pass to James's Protestant daughters from his first marriage, Mary, married to William of Orange, and Anne. Protestant England could tolerate a Catholic king as a temporary inconvenience, knowing that his Protestant successors would restore the proper order of things. Then, in June 1688, Mary of Modena gave birth to a healthy son. James Francis Edward Stuart, if he survived and if the Catholics had their way, would be raised in his father's faith and would continue the Catholic succession indefinitely. Protestant England panicked. Within weeks, a group of prominent nobles had sent an invitation to William of Orange, asking him to invade England and rescue the country from the Catholic threat. William accepted, landed at Torbay in November, and marched on London while James's support melted away. The king fled to France, his infant son and wife preceding him, and the Glorious Revolution was accomplished almost without bloodshed. The birth that triggered this upheaval was immediately surrounded by controversy. Protestant propagandists claimed that the baby was not really Mary's child at all, but a substitute smuggled into the birthing chamber in a warming pan. The story was almost certainly false. Dozens of witnesses had been present at the birth, including Protestant nobles who had every reason to expose a fraud, but it captured the Protestant refusal to accept that God would allow a Catholic heir to be born. The warming pan baby became a symbol of Catholic deception, another item in the long list of Popish plots that Protestant England believed itself surrounded by. James Francis Edward would spend his life trying to reclaim the throne his father had lost, leading the Jacobite cause through decades of exile and failed invasions. He was the old pretender, and his son Charles Edward, Bonnie Prince Charlie, would be the young pretender, the last serious hope of the Stuart Restoration, that ended in disaster at Culloden in 1746. But perhaps the most poignant story among the Stuart women is that of Mary, James II's eldest daughter, who chose her Protestant husband over her Catholic father and helped to depose the man who had raised her. Mary had been brought up Protestant despite her father's conversion, a compromise that James had accepted reluctantly, and that Protestant England had demanded as the price of tolerating a Catholic heir. She had married William of Orange in 1677, a political match designed to reassure Protestants that the Stuart succession would ultimately return to the true faith. The marriage was not happy. William was cold and distant, possibly more interested in male favourites than in his wife, but Mary was dutiful and devoted, trying to make the best of a situation she had not chosen. When William invaded England in 1688, Mary faced an impossible choice. Her father was the legitimate king, and the duty of a daughter was to support her father. But her husband was the champion of Protestant religion, and the duty of a Protestant was to resist Catholic tyranny. Mary chose her husband and her faith over her father and her blood. She sailed to England after William's victory, joined him as co-monarch in the unprecedented arrangement that made them King William III and Queen Mary II, and never saw her father again. James, in exile, reportedly wept when he learned of his daughter's choice. Mary, by all accounts, was haunted by guilt for the rest of her life. Mary died in 1694 of smallpox, just 6 years into her reign, before she could fully reckon with what she had done. William, who had treated her indifferently during her life, was devastated by her death and never remarried. The throne passed eventually to Mary's younger sister Anne, who had also sided with William against their father, but who had done so with less enthusiasm and more evident discomfort. Anne's reign would be the last of the Stuart monarchs. She died in 1714 without surviving children, and the crown passed to the German House of Hanover under the terms of the Act of Settlement that had excluded Catholics from the succession. The Stuart dynasty, which had begun with the son of an executed queen, ended with the daughter of a deposed king, the family having destroyed itself through the same religious conflicts that had plagued it from the beginning. The women of the Stuart dynasty did not rule in their own right, with the exception of Mary II and Anne, who came to the throne only through extraordinary circumstances, but they shaped events in ways that formal power cannot capture. Henrietta Maria's Catholicism poisoned the reign of Charles I. Mary of Modena's fertility triggered the Glorious Revolution. Princess Mary's betrayal legitimized William's usurpation. These women made choices, exercised influence, and suffered consequences alongside the men whose names dominate the history books. Their stories remind us that politics in the Stuart era was personal as well as institutional, driven by family relationships and religious convictions as much as by abstract principles of governance. The favourites and the queens together formed the inner circle of Stuart monarchy, the people closest to the crown who shaped how that crown was worn. They were loved and hated, trusted and betrayed, elevated and destroyed according to the shifting dynamics of power and personality. Their fates were tied to the fates of their monarchs, rising and falling with the fortunes of the dynasty they served. When the Stuarts thrived, their favourites prospered. When the Stuarts fell, their favourites fell with them, often harder and faster. The shadows behind the throne were never safe shadows, and the people who inhabited them knew that their privilege came with mortal risk. The Stuart century was a century of favourites, men like Buckingham, Strafford and Clarendon who accumulated power beyond their station and paid for it with exile or death. It was also a century of queens, women like Henrietta Maria and Mary of Modena, whose personal choices had political consequences they could not have foreseen. Together, the favourites and the queens created the intimate world of Stuart politics, the world of bedchambers and private audiences where real decisions were made and real influence was exercised. Understanding this world is essential to understanding why the Stuarts governed as they did and why their governance so often ended in disaster. The public conflicts between king and parliament were shaped by the private relationships that surrounded the throne, and those relationships were often as destructive as they were devoted. Kings have always understood that power is not just about armies and laws, it is also about perception. A monarch who looks weak is weak, regardless of how many soldiers he commands or how divine his right to rule. Conversely, a monarch who projects strength, dignity and divine favour can sometimes govern effectively even when his actual power is limited. The Stuarts understood this principle better than most, and no Stuart understood it better than Charles I, who invested more time, money and attention in crafting his royal image than perhaps any other English monarch in history. The irony, of course, is that this image-obsessed king ended up with one of the most memorable images in English history, his head separated from his body on a scaffold in front of his own palace, directly beneath a ceiling he had commissioned to celebrate the glory of monarchy. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humour that even the most careful image management cannot overcome. Charles I came to the throne in 1625 as something of an unlikely king. He had spent his childhood as the spare heir, overshadowed by his elder brother Henry, who was everything Charles was not. Tall, athletic, charismatic, the perfect Renaissance prince. Charles was short, suffered from a stammer, and had legs so weak from childhood rickets that he had difficulty walking until he was 7. When Henry died of typhoid fever in 1612, the 12-year-old Charles suddenly became heir to 3 kingdoms, a role for which nature seemed not to have designed him. The transformation that followed was one of the most remarkable acts of self-reinvention in royal history, and it was accomplished largely through art. Charles compensated for his physical limitations by cultivating an image of serene, elevated majesty. Where his father James had been informal and approachable, sometimes embarrassingly so, Charles was distant, ceremonial, and obsessed with proper protocol. He reformed the court, imposing strict rules about who could approach the king, how they should dress, and how they should behave in the royal presence. Access to Charles became increasingly restricted. Even senior courtiers had to pass through multiple antechambers before reaching the king, each stage a reminder of how far above ordinary mortals the monarch stood. This elaborate ceremonial served a political purpose, reinforcing the doctrine of divine right by making the king seem almost literally untouchable, a sacred figure set apart from the common run of humanity. But ceremony alone was not enough. Charles needed visual propaganda that would convey his majesty to those who would never see him in person, and that would shape how even those who did see him understood what they were seeing. For this, he turned to the greatest artist of his age, spending money he did not have on paintings, sculptures, and architectural projects that would proclaim the glory of Stuart monarchy to the world. The result was one of the finest art collections ever assembled by an English monarch, and one of the most controversial expenditures in an age when Parliament was increasingly reluctant to fund royal extravagance. The crown jewel of Charles's artistic patronage was the ceiling of the banqueting house in Whitehall, painted by Peter Paul Rubens, the most celebrated artist in Europe. The banqueting house itself was a masterpiece of architecture, designed by Inigo Jones in the new classical style that was revolutionising English building. It was intended as a setting for court masques, elaborate theatrical productions that combined music, dance, poetry, and spectacular visual effects to celebrate royal power. The building's stark, elegant exterior gave no hint of the explosion of colour and movement that Rubens would create on its ceiling. 9 enormous canvases depicting the apotheosis of James I, Charles's father, ascending to heaven surrounded by allegorical figures representing wisdom, justice, and peace. Rubens received the commission in 1629 and completed the paintings in his Antwerp studio over the next several years. The canvases were shipped to England and installed in 1635, transforming the banqueting house into a temple of Stuart ideology. The central panel shows James being carried heavenward by personifications of justice and peace, while cherubs and allegorical figures celebrate his wisdom in uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. Subsidiary panels depict the benefits of Stuart rule, abundance, prosperity, the triumph of virtue over vice. The overall message was clear. The Stuart monarchs were not merely earthly rulers, but participants in a divine order, their authority flowing directly from heaven, and their reign bringing blessings to their grateful subjects. The ceiling cost over £3,000, a substantial sum at a time when Charles was struggling to fund his government without parliamentary grants. Critics pointed out that the money might have been better spent on the navy or on relieving the poor, rather than on glorifying a king who seemed more interested in art than in governance. But Charles saw no contradiction between artistic patronage and effective rule. The ceiling was not decoration, it was propaganda, a visual argument for the legitimacy of Stuart monarchy that would be seen by every diplomat, courtier and official who passed through the banqueting house. In an age before mass media, such images were among the most powerful tools available for shaping public opinion, at least among the elite. The Rubens ceiling was part of a larger project that was never completed. A vast new palace at Whitehall that would have rivaled Versailles in scale and magnificence. Inigo Jones drew up plans for a building that would have stretched along the Thames, incorporating the banqueting house as merely one element in a complex of courts, galleries, and state apartments. The project was wildly ambitious and wildly expensive. Estimates ran into the millions of pounds, and it was abandoned as political and financial pressures mounted in the 1630s. The banqueting house remains today as the only completed fragment of this grandiose vision, a tantalising hint of what might have been if Charles had possessed the resources and the political capital to match his artistic ambitions. While Rubens provided the allegorical framework for Stuart ideology, it was Anthony van Dyck who created the personal image of Charles I that has dominated historical imagination ever since. Van Dyck arrived in England in 1632, already famous for his portraits of European aristocracy, and immediately became the king's principal painter. Over the next 9 years, until his death in 1641, Van Dyck produced dozens of portraits of Charles, his family and his court that defined how the Stuart monarchy wanted to be seen, and how subsequent generations have continued to see it. Van Dyck's genius was his ability to make his subjects look better than they actually were while still maintaining recognisable likenesses. This was particularly valuable for Charles, whose physical appearance was not naturally majestic. The king was short, probably about 5 feet 4 inches, with legs that remained somewhat weak throughout his life. In Van Dyck's portraits, these limitations disappear. The king is shown from angles that minimise his lack of height, often on horseback or positioned above the viewer's eye level. His features are refined and idealised, his expression one of calm authority, his posture conveying easy confidence rather than the stiff formality that apparently characterised him in person. Van Dyck dressed Charles in armour he probably never wore into battle, surrounded him with symbols of martial prowess he never demonstrated, and generally created an image of warrior kingship that had little connection to reality. The most famous of Van Dyck's royal portraits is the triple portrait of Charles I, painted in 1635 and sent to Rome so that the sculptor Gian Lorenzo Bernini could use it as a model for a marble bust. The painting shows Charles from 3 angles, left profile, full face and right 3/4 view, allowing Bernini to understand the king's features from multiple perspectives. The effect is haunting. 3 versions of the same face, yet each subtly different, as if the painting captures not just the king's appearance, but his multiplicity of roles and moods. Bernini, upon seeing the painting, reportedly remarked that the face showed signs of coming tragedy, though this story may be apocryphal, invented after the fact to give the portrait an air of prophecy. Van Dyck's portraits were not just personal vanity projects, they were instruments of foreign policy. Copies were sent to courts across Europe, spreading the image of Charles as a powerful, cultured, legitimate monarch at a time when his actual power was increasingly in question. The portraits were gifts to allies and potential allies, visual arguments for treating with the Stuart king as an equal. They were also collected by connoisseurs who appreciated their artistic merit regardless of their political message, spreading Charles's image into private collections where it might influence opinion in ways the king could never directly control. In an age of dynastic marriages and diplomatic negotiations conducted through personal relationships, such images mattered. A king who looked impressive in his portraits was more likely to be taken seriously than one who did not. The court mask was another crucial element in Stuart image-making, though it has left less visible traces than the paintings and architecture. Masks were elaborate theatrical productions performed at court, combining poetry, music, dance, and spectacular scenic effects to create immersive experiences that celebrated royal power. They were fantastically expensive. A single mask might cost as much as a modest military campaign, and they were performed for audiences of hundreds rather than thousands. Their purpose was not popular entertainment but elite indoctrination, demonstrating to the most powerful people in the kingdom the magnificence and legitimacy of Stuart rule. The masks typically featured members of the royal family and senior courtiers as performers, blurring the line between representation and reality. When Charles appeared in a mask as the embodiment of heroic virtue, he was not merely acting a part, he was, according to the ideology the masks promoted, revealing his true nature. The spectacular scenery, designed by Inigo Jones, who was as innovative in theatre as in architecture, used perspective illusions and mechanical effects to create transformations that seemed almost magical. Heavens opened to reveal divine figures descending to bless the royal couple. Chaotic scenes of disorder gave way to harmonious tableaux as royal virtue imposed order on the world. The message was always the same. Stuart monarchy was divinely ordained, and its rule brought peace, prosperity, and beauty to a grateful nation. Henrietta Maria was particularly prominent in these productions, playing roles that emphasized her virtue, beauty, and devoted partnership with her husband. Her participation was controversial. Queens did not traditionally appear on stage, and Puritan critics saw her theatrical activities as evidence of French Catholic corruption infecting the English court. The masks themselves were attacked as wasteful extravagance at a time when the country faced real problems that required real resources. But Charles and Henrietta Maria continued to commission and perform in masks throughout the 1630s, apparently convinced that the ideological benefits outweighed the political costs. They were probably wrong about this, but they were sincere in their conviction that art and spectacle were legitimate tools of governance. The collection that Charles assembled was remarkable not just for its quality, but for its scope. He acquired paintings by Titian, Raphael, Mantegna, Correggio, and virtually every other major Italian Renaissance master. He purchased the entire collection of the Duke of Mantua, one of the finest private collections in Europe, in a transaction that caused a scandal in Italy and depleted the English treasury. He employed agents across Europe to seek out works for purchase and to commission new pieces from contemporary artists. By the time of his death, Charles owned over 1,500 paintings, along with countless drawings, sculptures, tapestries, and other works of art, a collection that would be the envy of any modern museum. The acquisition of art on this scale was not cheap. Charles spent tens of thousands of pounds on paintings at a time when his government was chronically short of funds, and when Parliament was refusing to grant him the taxes he needed to govern effectively. The money for art had to come from somewhere, and it often came from sources that made the Crown's financial problems worse. When critics accused Charles of extravagance and mismanagement, the art collection was Exhibit A, tangible evidence that the king cared more about beautiful objects than about the welfare of his subjects. The collection became a political liability, a symbol of royal priorities that seemed increasingly disconnected from national needs. There was also a religious dimension to the criticism. Many of the paintings in Charles's collection depicted Catholic religious subjects, saints, martyrdoms, the Virgin Mary, executed in the sensuous, emotionally charged style of the Counter-Reformation. To Puritan eyes, these images were not just aesthetically objectionable but spiritually dangerous, gateways to the idolatry and superstition that Protestantism had rejected. The presence of such works in the royal collection seemed to confirm suspicions that Charles and his Catholic wife were secretly sympathetic to Rome, that the religious ceremonies Charles favoured, with their emphasis on beauty, ritual and sacrament, were steps toward the restoration of Catholicism in England. The art collection was read, like everything else about Charles's reign, through the lens of religious anxiety. The architectural projects that Charles sponsored reinforced his image as a patron of classical order and rational beauty. Inigo Jones's buildings, the Banqueting House, the Queen's House at Greenwich, the portico of St. Paul's Cathedral, introduced to England the classical vocabulary that Jones had studied in Italy, based on the principles of the ancient Roman architect. Vitruvius and his Renaissance interpreter Andrea Palladio. These buildings looked nothing like the medieval and Tudor structures that still dominated the English landscape. They were symmetrical, proportioned according to mathematical ratios, decorated with columns and pediments drawn from ancient models. They proclaimed a new aesthetic order that paralleled the political order Charles was trying to impose, rational, hierarchical, grounded in timeless principles. The connection between architectural classicism and political absolutism was not accidental. The same classical vocabulary was being used across Catholic Europe to express the power of centralizing monarchies and the Counter-Reformation Church. When English Protestants looked at Jones's buildings, they saw not just a new architectural style, but a political and religious statement, an assertion of royal authority drawing on models associated with Catholic tyranny. The buildings were beautiful by almost any standard, but their beauty carried ideological freight that made them controversial. Like the masks and the paintings, they were arguments in visual form, arguments that not everyone found persuasive. Charles's investment in image was both symptom and cause of his political difficulties. It was a symptom because it reflected his genuine belief that kingship was about dignity, ceremony, and the proper maintenance of royal authority. concerns that seemed increasingly irrelevant to subjects worried about taxation, religion, and constitutional rights. It was a cause because the money spent on art and architecture was money not spent on building political alliances, rewarding potential supporters, or addressing the grievances that were driving Parliament toward confrontation. Charles was playing a long game, trying to establish an image of monarchy that would endure for generations, while his opponents were playing a short game focused on immediate political advantage. The short game won. When civil war came, the royal image that Charles had so carefully constructed was used against him. Parliamentary propaganda depicted the king not as the dignified, divinely appointed monarch of Van Dyck's portraits, but as a tyrant, a man of blood, an enemy of English liberty. The same artistic techniques that had served Stuart ideology were turned to opposite purposes, producing prints and pamphlets that portrayed Charles as a villain rather than a hero. The battle for public opinion was fought with images as well as words, and Charles discovered that he could not control how his image was interpreted once it left his hands. The serene majesty of Van Dyck's king became, in hostile hands, the arrogance of a ruler who thought himself above the law. The ultimate irony came on January 30th, 1649, when Charles walked to his execution through the banqueting house, passing beneath the Rubens ceiling that proclaimed his father's apotheosis. The windows of the banqueting house had been sealed, and a platform had been constructed outside, but Charles would have known exactly where he was and what lay above him. The paintings that glorified Stuart monarchy looked down on a Stuart king being led to his death, the divine authority they celebrated about to be definitively rejected by the men who would kill an anointed monarch. Whether Charles reflected on this irony as he walked to the scaffold, we do not know. He was reportedly calm and dignified, meeting his death with the same studied composure he had cultivated throughout his reign. Even at the end, he was managing his image. The execution itself was carefully staged by both sides. Charles dressed in 2 shirts so that he would not shiver from the January cold and be thought afraid. He delivered a speech from the scaffold, maintaining to the last his belief in divine right and his innocence of the crimes for which he was dying. The crowd was kept at a distance by soldiers, preventing any attempt at rescue but also ensuring that few could hear the king's final words. When the axe fell and the head was severed, an eyewitness reported that the crowd let out a groan. Whether of horror, relief, or simply shock, no one could say. The head was held up for the crowd to see, the traditional gesture after an execution, but the executioner did not speak the traditional words. There was nothing to say that would make sense of what had just happened. After Charles's death, his art collection was sold off by the Commonwealth government, scattered across Europe to raise money for the new regime. Some of the finest paintings went to foreign buyers who had no political objection to owning works from a dead king's collection. The dispersal of the collection was both practical, the Commonwealth needed funds, and symbolic, a repudiation of everything the collection represented. The careful, expensive construction of Stuart royal image was undone in a series of auctions. The paintings that had proclaimed divine right now mere commodities to be bought and sold by anyone with sufficient funds. When Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, he made some effort to recover his father's collection, buying back what he could and accepting the return of works that had remained in England. But the collection could never be fully reassembled. Too many pieces had been sold to buyers who had no intention of giving them up. Too many had disappeared into private collections across Europe. The Mantua pictures, the Titians and Raphaels that had been the pride of Charles I's collection, were largely gone. What remained was a shadow of what had been, a reminder of both artistic achievement and political catastrophe. The Stuarts who came after Charles I continued to patronise art, but with less intensity and less ideological purpose. Charles II preferred pleasure to propaganda. His court was famous for its mistresses and its revelry, not for its high-minded celebration of divine right. James II had other concerns, trying to advance Catholic interests in a Protestant country without getting himself deposed, a project at which he spectacularly failed. The later Stuarts understood that the direct identification of art with royal ideology that had characterised Charles I's reign was politically dangerous, that the money and attention spent on image-making might be better directed elsewhere. They were probably right, though the result was a court culture that was less artistically distinguished than that of Charles I, whatever its other merits. The artistic legacy of the Stuart era survived the dynasty itself. The Rubens ceiling remains in the banqueting house, now a tourist attraction where visitors can lie on the floor and stare upward at the same paintings that Charles I walked beneath on his way to death. Van Dyck's portraits hang in museums and galleries around the world, shaping how we visualize the 17th century even when we know that the images were propaganda rather than documentation. Inigo Jones's buildings established the classical tradition in English architecture that would dominate for the next 2 centuries. The artistic investments that seemed so extravagant and politically damaging in their own time have proved remarkably durable, outlasting the political system they were meant to support. This durability raises interesting questions about the relationship between art and power. Charles I used art to promote an ideology of divine right monarchy that was rejected by his own subjects, leading to civil war, regicide, and the temporary abolition of the monarchy itself. By any immediate political measure, his artistic patronage was a failure. Money wasted on propaganda that failed to propagandize. Yet the art survives and continues to affect how we understand the period. When we think of Charles I, we think of Van Dyck's portraits, with their calm authority and elegant dignity. We do not think of the small, stammering, stubborn man who alienated his subjects through religious and constitutional overreach. The image has triumphed over the reality, at least in popular imagination. Perhaps this was Charles's ultimate achievement, not winning the political battles of his own time, but winning the aesthetic battle for how his time would be remembered. The execution that ended his life became, in royalist mythology, a martyrdom. Charles was even declared a saint by some elements of the Anglican Church. The dignity he displayed at his death, the careful management of his image to the very end, created a counter-narrative to the parliamentary case against him, a narrative of noble suffering rather than just punishment. The art he patronised contributed to this narrative, providing visual evidence of a court culture that was refined, sophisticated, and worthy of admiration even by those who disapproved of its politics. The Stuarts built their image with paint and canvas, with marble and masonry, with poetry and music and theatrical spectacle. They invested enormous resources in the project, resources that might have been used for more practical purposes and that contributed to the financial difficulties that undermined their rule. Yet the image they created has endured, surviving political upheavals that destroyed everything else they built. The banqueting house still stands, Van Dyck's portraits still mesmerize, the masks are still studied by scholars trying to understand the culture that produced them. Charles I failed as a king, but he succeeded as a patron of art. Whether that trade-off was worth it depends on what you value: political effectiveness or aesthetic achievement, the judgment of contemporaries or the judgment of posterity. The fate of individual artworks from Charles's collection tells its own story about the intersection of art and politics. The Mantegna Triumphs of Caesar, 9 enormous canvases depicting a Roman victory procession, had been one of the most prized possessions in the Mantua collection that Charles acquired. These paintings showed the pageantry of ancient imperial power, soldiers carrying spoils, musicians playing triumphal music, the victorious general riding in his chariot, subjects that resonated with Stuart ideas about the majesty of monarchy. After the sale of Charles's collection, the triumphs remained in England, eventually returning to royal ownership at the Restoration. They hang today at Hampton Court, still impressive despite centuries of wear and restoration, a reminder of the artistic ambitions that Charles pursued even as his political position crumbled. Other works were less fortunate. Paintings that had been acquired at enormous expense were sold for fractions of their purchase price. The market flooded with masterpieces that buyers could acquire at bargain rates if they had no qualms about benefiting from regicide. Cardinal Mazarin, the chief minister of France, was a particularly aggressive buyer, snapping up works that would form the nucleus of what eventually became French royal collections. The Spanish ambassador acquired pieces for Philip IV. Private collectors across Europe took advantage of what was essentially a fire sale of one of the continent's great collections. The dispersal was so thorough that scholars are still discovering works from Charles's collection in unexpected places, paintings that changed hands multiple times over the centuries and lost their provenance in the process. The Commonwealth and Protectorate governments that ruled England between 1649 and 1660 had an ambivalent relationship with the artistic heritage they had inherited. On one hand, they needed money, and selling the royal collection was an obvious source of revenue. On the other hand, some of the new rulers appreciated art for its own sake and were reluctant to see everything dispersed. Oliver Cromwell himself was not entirely indifferent to visual culture. He had his portrait painted by Samuel Cooper, and he preserved some of the royal palaces rather than demolishing them as symbols of tyranny. The banqueting house ceiling was left intact, perhaps because removing it would have been technically difficult, perhaps because even Republicans could appreciate the artistic achievement it represented. There was also the practical question of what Republican government should look like. The Stuarts had invested heavily in the visual representation of monarchy, but what should the visual representation of a Commonwealth be? The problem was genuinely difficult. The classical models that had informed Stuart iconography, Roman emperors, ancient temples, allegorical goddesses, were not obviously suited to a regime that claimed to reject tyranny and embrace the sovereignty of the people. Some attempts were made to develop a Republican visual language, but they never achieved the coherence or magnificence of Stuart propaganda. The Commonwealth simply could not compete with the accumulated visual splendour of centuries of monarchy, which may be one reason why the Republican experiment ultimately failed. People need symbols to rally around, and the Republicans never found symbols as compelling as the crown they had rejected. The Restoration in 1660 brought an attempt to reverse the cultural as well as political revolution. Charles II worked to recover what he could of his father's collection, and the returning court brought with it tastes and practices that consciously echoed the pre-war years. But the effort was only partially successful. Too much had been lost, too much had changed, and the new king had different priorities than his father. Charles II was a patron of science and architecture. He founded the Royal Society and commissioned Christopher Wren to rebuild London after the Great Fire, but he never matched his father's dedication to painting and sculpture. The moment of Stuart artistic magnificence was over, a brief flowering that could not be sustained through civil war and its aftermath. What remained was memory and mythology. The royalist narrative of Charles I as martyr king required a corresponding narrative of his reign as a golden age, a time of peace, prosperity, and cultural achievement cut short by fanatical rebels. This narrative was not entirely false. The 1630s, the period of Charles's personal rule without Parliament, had been a time of relative stability and genuine artistic achievement, but it was certainly selective, ignoring the religious and political conflicts that had made the period so controversial. The image of the Caroline court as an island of civilization surrounded by Puritan barbarism became a staple of royalist mythology, influencing how subsequent generations understood both the period and the civil war that ended it. Van Dyck's portraits were central to this mythology. They showed a court of elegant, refined aristocrats, men and women of taste and breeding, who seemed to belong to a different species from the crop-haired fanatics who supposedly destroyed them. The portraits were evidence in royalist eyes of what had been lost, a civilization, a way of life, a standard of beauty and excellence that the Commonwealth had trampled. Never mind that many of Van Dyck's subjects were parliamentarians or time servers who had adapted easily to changing political circumstances. The portraits froze them in a moment of Stuart elegance, permanently associated with the doomed monarchy regardless of what they actually did during the Civil War. The equation of Stuart culture with civilization itself had lasting effects on English attitudes toward art and politics. For generations afterward, there was a tendency to associate artistic refinement with royalism and Puritanism with Philistine iconoclasm. This association was not entirely unjustified. The Puritans really did smash church windows and destroy religious images as part of their campaign against idolatry, but it was also simplistic, ignoring the genuine artistic achievements of Protestant culture and the genuine vulgarity of much royalist behaviour. The cultural politics of the Stuart era cast a long shadow, shaping aesthetic assumptions that persisted long after the specific political conflicts had been forgotten. The art of power and the power of art were never more closely intertwined than in the reign of Charles I. He believed that a king who looked magnificent was magnificent, that the projection of royal authority through visual means was as important as its exercise through political means. His subjects disagreed, seeing in his artistic extravagance evidence of misplaced priorities and personal vanity. Both sides were right in their own way. Charles was vain, and his priorities were misplaced, at least from the perspective of practical politics. But he was also creating something of lasting value, works of art that would survive him and his dynasty and his entire political order. The scaffold beneath the Rubens ceiling was the end of Charles I the king, but it was not the end of Charles I the patron. The paintings remain, still proclaiming the glory of Stuart monarchy, to visitors who no longer believe in divine right, but who cannot help being impressed by the skill with which that belief was visualized. Wars are expensive. This is one of those observations that sounds obvious but whose implications are profound. You can have the most righteous cause in the world, the most brilliant generals, the most motivated soldiers, but if you cannot pay for weapons, supplies, and wages, you will lose. The English Civil War was no exception to this rule. When the fighting began in 1642, both sides quickly discovered that enthusiasm and ideology were no substitute for hard cash. The side that could better mobilize economic resources would win, regardless of who had God on their side. And from the very beginning, the economic advantages favoured Parliament, a fact that would prove decisive in determining the outcome of the conflict and the fate of the Stuart dynasty. To understand why the Civil War turned out the way it did, we need to understand the financial situation of the Stuart monarchy, which can be summarised in one word: desperate. The Stuarts were never solvent. From the moment James I arrived in England in 1603 to the moment his grandson James II fled the country in 1688, the Crown was perpetually short of money, perpetually borrowing, perpetually searching for new sources of revenue that would not require going cap in hand to Parliament. This chronic financial weakness was not simply bad luck or poor management, though there was plenty of both. It was structural, built into the very nature of English government, and it shaped everything the Stuarts tried to do. The problem began with the medieval fiscal system that the Stuarts inherited. English kings were traditionally expected to live of their own, to fund the ordinary expenses of government from their own revenues, primarily income from crown lands and the traditional customs duties. Parliament was supposed to vote additional taxes only for extraordinary expenses, mainly wars. This system had worked reasonably well in the Middle Ages, when government was small and kings spent most of their time on their estates. It worked less well as government became more complex and expensive, and it worked not at all by the 17th century, when inflation had eroded the real value of traditional revenues, while the costs of administration, diplomacy, and defence had multiplied. Elizabeth I had managed to make the system work through a combination of fiscal conservatism, creative accounting, and occasional bouts of piracy that brought Spanish treasure into English coffers. She had also benefited from the dissolution of the monasteries under her father, which had temporarily enriched the crown with confiscated church lands. But Elizabeth had also sold off much of this land to fund her wars, and by the time she died, the crown's landed income was a fraction of what it had been a century earlier. James I inherited a treasury that was effectively empty, and a fiscal system that was structurally incapable of generating adequate revenue. He also inherited expensive tastes and no particular talent for economy. The result was predictable. James spent money with a freedom that shocked his more frugal subjects. He showered gifts on his favourites, funded elaborate court entertainments, and generally lived as though the royal treasury were bottomless when it was in fact bone dry. His defenders pointed out that much of this spending was politically necessary. A king had to reward loyalty and maintain the magnificence expected of a monarch. But even sympathetic observers found it hard to justify the scale of James's extravagance. The contrast with Elizabeth, who had been famously careful with money, was striking and unflattering. Within a few years of James's accession, the crown debt had doubled, and it would continue to grow throughout his reign. The obvious solution was to ask Parliament for more money, but this was easier said than done. Parliamentary taxation in early modern England was based on the subsidy, a tax on income and movable property that was assessed by local commissioners who had every incentive to undervalue their neighbours' wealth. The result was that subsidies raised far less than they should have, perhaps a quarter of what a properly assessed tax would have produced. Parliament was also reluctant to vote subsidies at all, correctly perceiving that doing so would reduce its leverage over the crown. The power of the purse was Parliament's main bargaining chip in its relationship with the monarchy, and members were not eager to give that chip away without getting something in return. James found himself in an impossible position. He needed more money than Parliament would vote him, but he could not simply raise taxes on his own authority. That would violate the fundamental constitutional principle that taxation required parliamentary consent. Or could he? The question of what the king could and could not do without Parliament was murky, surrounded by competing precedents and conflicting interpretations. James and his advisers began exploring the grey areas, looking for sources of revenue that might technically fall within the royal prerogative. What they found would set the stage for the constitutional conflicts that eventually tore the country apart. One solution was to sell things. James discovered that there was a ready market for honours, knighthoods, baronetcies, peerages, and he began selling them with enthusiasm. The Order of the Baronet was created in 1611 specifically as a revenue-raising device. Men who paid a set fee received a hereditary title that ranked above knights, but below barons. The going rate was about £1,000, which sounds like a lot but was actually quite reasonable for a permanent upgrade in social status. Baronetcies proved popular enough that hundreds were sold during James's reign, generating significant income for the crown and significant resentment from traditional aristocrats who saw their ranks diluted by wealthy upstarts. The sale of peerages was more controversial. Barons, viscounts and earls had traditionally been created by the monarch as rewards for service, not sold to the highest bidder. James changed this, creating a market in nobility that his subjects found distasteful. The Duke of Buckingham, James's favourite, ran a particularly lucrative business in titles, brokering deals between the crown and ambitious men who wanted to buy their way into the House of Lords. The prices were steep. An earldom might cost £20,000 or more, but there were buyers, and the money helped keep the royal government afloat. The long-term cost was the devaluation of honours themselves. Titles that had once signified royal favour and distinguished service now signified only that their holders had deep pockets. James also exploited the system of monopolies, granting exclusive rights to produce or sell certain commodities in exchange for payments to the crown. Monopolies had existed under Elizabeth, but James expanded the system dramatically, covering everything from playing cards to salt to the dyeing of cloth. The monopolists paid handsomely for their privileges and then recouped their investment by charging consumers higher prices than would have prevailed in a competitive market. This was effectively a hidden tax, one that fell disproportionately on the poor and middling sort who consumed the monopolised goods. Parliament objected strenuously, and in 1624 James was forced to accept a statute of monopolies that restricted the practice. But the basic impulse to find revenue outside parliamentary control remained. Another controversial revenue source was impositions, additional customs duties that the Crown claimed the right to levy without parliamentary approval. The legal basis for impositions was shaky, resting on the royal prerogative over foreign trade that had never been precisely defined. When a merchant named John Bate refused to pay an imposition on currants, arguing that it was an illegal tax, the case went to court, and the court ruled for the king. Bate's case in 1606 established that the king could levy impositions at his discretion, a decision that delighted the Crown and alarmed Parliament. If the king could tax imports without consent, what was to stop him from taxing everything without consent? The constitutional implications were enormous, and Parliament spent years trying to reverse or limit the decision. The revenue from all these sources, sales of honours, monopolies, impositions, traditional customs, was never enough. James died in 1625 owing over £1 million, a staggering sum that his son Charles inherited along with all the political problems that had created it. Charles was no better at managing money than his father, and his situation was even worse because he was determined to pursue an aggressive foreign policy that required military spending far beyond what his revenues could support. Within 3 years of his accession, Charles was at war with both Spain and France simultaneously, funding naval expeditions that accomplished nothing except demonstrating how badly the English military had deteriorated. Charles's desperate search for revenue led him to expedients that were even more controversial than his father's. The most notorious was ship money, a traditional levy that required coastal towns to provide ships for the Royal Navy in times of emergency. Charles extended this levy to inland counties and collected it not just in emergencies but every year, effectively creating a new annual tax without parliamentary consent. Ship money was efficient. It raised substantial sums and was collected effectively. But it was also clearly illegal in the view of most legal experts. When a Buckinghamshire gentleman named John Hampden refused to pay and took his case to court, the judges ruled narrowly for the king, but the ruling satisfied no one. Hampden became a hero to those who saw ship money as tyrannical, and the case demonstrated that the courts could not be relied upon to check royal overreach. The personal rule, the 11 years from 1629 to 1640 when Charles governed without Parliament, was an experiment in whether the English monarchy could survive on its own financial resources. Charles discovered that it could, barely, but only by aggressive exploitation of every possible revenue source, and rigorous economy and expenditure. Ship money, forest fines, exploitation of feudal dues, sales of monopolies and various other devices generated enough income to keep the government functioning in peacetime. But there was no margin for error and no capacity for the kind of large-scale military expenditure that warfare would require. The personal rule was built on financial sand, and when Charles needed to raise an army to suppress rebellion in Scotland in 1639, the whole structure collapsed. The Scottish rebellion forced Charles to call Parliament, the Long Parliament, as it would come to be known, and Parliament was in no mood to simply hand over money without addressing grievances that had accumulated over years of rule without consent. The members wanted accountability for illegal taxes, punishment for the ministers who had enforced them, and guarantees that such abuses would not recur. They got most of what they wanted in the first year of the Parliament, including the execution of the Earl of Strafford, the abolition of ship money, and laws requiring regular parliamentary sessions. But trust had broken down so completely that even these concessions were not enough. Both sides suspected the other of bad faith, and both were right to be suspicious. The constitutional settlement of 1641 satisfied nobody, and within a year the country was at war. When civil war came, the financial advantages lay overwhelmingly with Parliament. London, the largest and wealthiest city in England, sided with Parliament from the beginning. The capital's population of perhaps 400,000, enormous by contemporary standards, included the wealthiest merchants in the kingdom, men who could provide loans and organise the financing of military operations. London's trained bands, the citizen militia, formed a significant military force that could defend the city and release regular troops for service elsewhere. And London's strategic position, controlling the Thames and the roads to the south and east, meant that whoever held the capital controlled the commercial heart of the kingdom. Parliament also controlled the navy, which was crucial for several reasons. The navy could blockade royalist ports, preventing the king from importing weapons and supplies from sympathetic European powers. It could protect parliamentary shipping while attacking royalist commerce, and it could project power along the coasts supporting parliamentary land forces and threatening royalist positions from the sea. The navy had traditionally been loyal to the crown, but the sailors' grievances about unpaid wages and poor conditions had alienated them from Charles, and when war came, they sided with the institution that seemed most likely to address their concerns and pay their bills. The economic geography of England strongly favoured Parliament. The south and east, the regions that Parliament controlled, were the wealthiest parts of the country, with the most developed agriculture, the most active commerce, and the largest populations. London dominated English trade, but the other eastern ports, Bristol before it fell to the Royalists, Hull, Plymouth, were also significant commercial centres that contributed to parliamentary resources. The manufacturing districts of East Anglia, producing the cloth that was England's main export, were firmly in parliamentary hands. Parliament controlled perhaps 2/3 of the country's taxable wealth from the beginning of the war, a proportion that grew as the conflict progressed. The Royalist territories, by contrast, were generally poorer and more thinly populated. The north and west of England had less developed agriculture, fewer towns, and less commercial activity. Wales was solidly royalist but was among the poorest regions of the kingdom. The king had enthusiastic support from many of the traditional aristocracy, but aristocratic enthusiasm did not translate directly into military resources. Land-rich nobles could raise regiments from their tenants and dependents, but they often struggled to pay and supply those regiments once raised. The royalist war effort was chronically underfunded, dependent on loans that could not be repaid and promises that could not be kept. Charles did have some economic advantages. He controlled significant areas of productive farmland that could feed his armies. He held Oxford, which became his wartime capital, and the surrounding counties. He received substantial contributions from loyalist nobles and gentry who donated their plate, their jewellery, and their cash to the royal cause. Foreign powers, particularly Charles's wife's relatives in France, provided some assistance, though never as much as the royalists hoped. And the king had, at least initially, most of the experienced military officers, men who had served in the continental wars and knew how to command troops in battle. But economic resources mattered more than military experience in a prolonged conflict, and the prolonged conflict that the Civil War became favoured the side with deeper pockets. The financial machinery that Parliament developed to fund the war was remarkably sophisticated. The weekly assessment, a tax on real and personal property, raised unprecedented sums by imposing rates far higher than traditional subsidies had ever attempted. The excise, a tax on consumer goods, particularly beer, was introduced in 1643 and proved extremely effective at generating revenue, though extremely unpopular with those who had to pay it. The sequestration of royalist estates provided both income from rents and a reserve of land that could be sold to raise capital. Parliamentary committees managed these revenues with an efficiency that the royal government had never achieved, channeling resources to where they were most needed and keeping reasonable accounts of income and expenditure. The royalist financial administration was less impressive. Charles never established a unified system for collecting and distributing resources. Instead, regional commanders raised what they could locally and spent it on their own forces. This decentralized approach had some advantages. It allowed flexibility and reduced the burden on the king's limited administrative capacity. But it also meant that resources were not allocated efficiently. Strong commanders hoarded supplies while weak ones went without. Wealthy regions were overtaxed while poor regions contributed little. The king had no reliable information about his own finances, no ability to plan for future needs, and no mechanism for enforcing discipline on subordinates, who were essentially running their own little armies within the broader royalist coalition. The contrast in financial management reflected deeper differences in the two sides' approach to governance. Parliament was, whatever else it was, an institution designed for collective decision-making and administrative organisation. Its members included experienced administrators, lawyers, and merchants who understood how complex organisations worked. The parliamentary war effort drew on this expertise, creating committees for specific tasks, establishing chains of accountability, and maintaining records that allowed for oversight and correction. The result was not pretty. Committee government was slow, contentious, and often corrupt. But it worked well enough to keep the parliamentary armies in the field year after year. The royalist side was organised around personal loyalty to the king, which had advantages in terms of motivation but severe disadvantages in terms of administration. Charles was not a good administrator. He made decisions slowly, changed his mind frequently, and had difficulty delegating authority to subordinates. The nobles and gentlemen who formed the backbone of the royalist command expected to be treated as partners rather than employees, which made imposing uniform policies nearly impossible. The royalist war effort was a coalition of local magnates, each with their own priorities and their own resources, held together by loyalty to Charles, but not by any effective central organisation. When that coalition faced a more disciplined opponent with superior resources, the outcome was predictable. The turning point came with the creation of the New Model Army in 1645. This was not just a military reform, but a financial one. The new model consolidated the various parliamentary armies into a single force of about 22,000 men, funded by a dedicated stream of revenue from the monthly assessment. Soldiers received regular pay, not generous, but reliable, which meant they could be subjected to strict discipline and directed to wherever they were needed without worrying about local loyalties or supply lines. The new model was expensive, absorbing a huge proportion of parliamentary resources, but it was also effective in a way that earlier parliamentary forces had not been. Its victories at Naseby and Langport in 1645 effectively ended the first phase of the Civil War. Charles surrendered to the Scottish army in 1646, hoping to play his captors against Parliament and somehow emerge with his throne intact. He failed. The Scots eventually handed him over to Parliament in exchange for payment of their military expenses. Even in the midst of political crisis, the money had to be sorted out, and Charles spent the next 2 years as a prisoner, negotiating with various factions while the country debated what to do with him. His execution in 1649 was many things: a political act, a religious statement, a constitutional revolution, but it was also, in a sense, a bankruptcy proceeding. The Stuart monarchy had run out of credit, literally and figuratively. The king who had never been able to pay his bills finally paid the ultimate price. The interregnum, the period of Republican government between 1649 and 1660, demonstrated both the possibilities and the limits of government without a king. The Commonwealth and Protectorate regimes were far more efficient at extracting revenue than the Stuarts had ever been. The monthly assessment continued, the excise was extended, and confiscated royalist and church lands were sold to raise capital. The military establishment that had won the war remained in place, expensive but effective, projecting English power abroad in ways that Charles I could only have dreamed of. Cromwell's navy dominated the seas, his armies intervened in European conflicts, his government commanded respect from foreign powers who had dismissed the Stuarts as impoverished weaklings. But this fiscal efficiency came at a cost. Taxes were higher under the Republic than they had ever been under the monarchy, and they fell on a population weary of war and resentful of military rule. The army that consumed so much of the budget was also the army that kept the regime in power, which made the Republic appear to be what it largely was, a military dictatorship dressed up in constitutional language. When Cromwell died in 1658 and his son Richard proved unable to manage the competing factions, the whole structure collapsed with remarkable speed. The army that had made the Republic also unmade it, eventually inviting Charles II to return from exile and restore the monarchy. The Restoration Settlement of 1660 tried to put the fiscal genie back in the bottle, establishing a revenue settlement that was supposed to give the Crown enough money to govern without resort to the illegal expedients of the past. Parliament voted Charles II customs duties for life, plus additional revenues from the excise and other sources, calculated to produce about £1,200,000 annually, enough, in theory, to fund the ordinary expenses of government. In practice, the settlement never worked as intended. The revenues fell short of projections, Charles's expenses exceeded his income, and the Crown was soon back to its familiar position of chronic shortage. The fundamental problem had not been solved. English government cost more than the English fiscal system was designed to provide, and until that structural imbalance was addressed, the Crown would always be financially dependent on Parliament. Charles II managed this dependency with more skill than his father had shown. He accepted that he could not rule without Parliament, and generally avoided the kind of direct confrontations over money that had destroyed his father. When Parliament refused to fund his policies, he modified his policies rather than attempting to govern without consent. He also received secret subsidies from Louis XIV of France, which gave him some financial independence from Parliament, a dependency of his own, but a less politically explosive one than domestic taxation without consent. Charles was lazy, cynical, and morally flexible in ways that served him well as a politician. He had learned from his father's fate that it was better to bend than to break. James II had learned nothing. When he came to the throne in 1685, he inherited a fiscal situation that was actually reasonably healthy. Parliamentary taxes were yielding more than expected, and the Crown debt was manageable. But James proceeded to alienate Parliament so thoroughly that within 3 years he had lost his throne. His fall in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 was primarily about religion, not money, but the financial settlement that followed transformed the relationship between Crown and Parliament forever. The Bill of Rights prohibited taxation without parliamentary consent in terms that left no room for ambiguity. The Annual Mutiny Act, which authorised the existence of a standing army, had to be renewed every year by Parliament, giving the legislature ongoing control over the military. And the growing expense of William III's wars against France made regular parliamentary sessions essential, ending any possibility of the Crown ruling independently as the early Stuarts had attempted. The financial conflicts of the Stuart era were thus resolved not by one side winning decisively, but by the emergence of a new system in which both Crown and Parliament had defined roles. The king retained executive power but could not tax without consent. Parliament controlled the purse but needed the king to govern. The Bank of England, established in 1694, created a mechanism for the government to borrow at reasonable rates, backed by parliamentary guarantee of repayment. This financial infrastructure would fund Britain's rise to global power in the 18th century, making possible the wars, the colonies, and the naval supremacy that created the British Empire. The fiscal chaos of the Stuarts gave way to the fiscal efficiency of their successors, though the transition was painful and the price was one king's head and another king's exile. Looking back at the economics of the Stuart era, what stands out is how much turned on questions that might seem mundane. Taxation rates, customs duties, the sale of honours, these are not the stuff of dramatic narrative. Yet they shaped the course of English history as profoundly as any battle or religious controversy. The Civil War was fought over constitutional principles and religious beliefs, but it was won and lost on economic grounds. The side with more money, better organisation, and superior access to credit prevailed over the side with more enthusiasm and arguably better generals. Money is not everything in warfare, but it is most things, and the Stuarts never had enough of it. The Stuart experience also illustrates a broader truth about the relationship between fiscal systems and political power. A government that cannot fund itself independently is a government that must negotiate with those who control resources. The English Parliament gained power over centuries precisely because the Crown needed its consent to tax, and every fiscal crisis strengthened Parliament's bargaining position. The Stuarts tried to escape this dependency through various expedients, some clever and some desperate, but none of them worked. In the end, they had to accept that ruling England meant ruling with Parliament, not against it. Those who refused to accept this reality lost their thrones and, in one notable case, their heads. The human cost of these financial conflicts is easy to overlook when discussing tax rates and revenue projections. But behind every fiscal measure were real people whose lives were affected by how the government raised and spent money. The ship money that John Hampden refused to pay was not an abstract constitutional principle. It was a demand for cash from farmers and merchants who had their own bills to pay and their own families to feed. The excise on beer that funded Parliament's armies raised prices for working people who had no stake in the political disputes of their betters. The sequestration of royalist estates ruined families who had backed the wrong side, while enriching speculators who bought confiscated lands at bargain prices. Fiscal policy was not just about balancing budgets, it was about who would bear the burdens and who would reap the benefits of government action. The soldiers who fought the Civil War often had very concrete financial motivations. Parliamentary soldiers expected regular pay, and when they did not receive it, they mutinied, as they did repeatedly in 1647 when Parliament tried to disband the army without settling its arrears. Royalist soldiers, whose pay was even more irregular, frequently resorted to plunder, which alienated the civilian population and made the king's cause harder to sustain. The new model army's effectiveness was directly related to its relatively reliable pay system, which allowed its commanders to maintain discipline and direct operations strategically. Soldiers who knew they would be paid could be ordered to march across the country without worrying about where their next meal was coming from. Soldiers who were not paid had to forage, which was a polite way of saying they had to steal from the people they were supposedly protecting. The economic devastation of the Civil War itself should not be underestimated. Towns were besieged and sometimes destroyed. Farmland was trampled by armies and left uncultivated while workers served as soldiers. Trade was disrupted by military operations and naval blockades. The population of some areas declined significantly, not primarily from battle deaths. These were relatively few, but from disease, displacement, and the general disruption of normal life. Recovery took years, and some communities never fully returned to their pre-war prosperity. The economic cost of the conflict was probably greater than any conscious policy decision by either side, a reminder that war is the most expensive government program of all. The money and the sword were never really separate. The sword was paid for with money, and the money was protected by the sword. The Stuarts learned this lesson the hard way through bankruptcy, civil war, and revolution. Their successors learned from their example, building a fiscal military state that would dominate the world for 2 centuries. The economic failures of the Stuart monarchy were, in a sense, the birth pangs of modern Britain. Painful, bloody, and ultimately productive of something new. The dynasty that never balanced its books nevertheless left a legacy that shaped how governments would finance themselves for generations to come. The trial of Charles I began on January 20th, 1649, in Westminster Hall, the ancient heart of English justice. The setting was deliberately chosen for its symbolic weight. This was where kings had been crowned, where parliaments had met, where the great constitutional dramas of English history had played out for centuries. Now it would witness something unprecedented in European history, the public trial of an anointed monarch by his own subjects. The men who organised this spectacle understood that they were doing something extraordinary, something that would echo through the ages. They were right about that, though perhaps not in the way they hoped. The court that assembled to try Charles was not exactly what you would call broadly representative. Of the 135 commissioners originally named to sit in judgment, only 68 actually showed up for the trial, and even fewer would sign the eventual death warrant. Many of those appointed found urgent business elsewhere. Some developed mysterious illnesses, others simply stayed home and hoped the whole thing would blow over. The judges who did attend knew they were risking their own lives. If the political winds shifted, they would be the ones facing charges of treason. It takes a particular kind of conviction, or perhaps a particular kind of recklessness, to sign your name to the execution of a king. 59 men would eventually do so, and their signatures would haunt them and their descendants for generations. Charles refused to recognise the court's authority from the moment he entered Westminster Hall. When the charges were read, that Charles Stuart had traitorously and maliciously levied war against the present Parliament and the people therein represented, the king simply smiled and shook his head. When asked to plead guilty or not guilty, he refused to plead at all. His argument was simple and, from his perspective, irrefutable. No earthly court had jurisdiction over an anointed king. The people could not try their sovereign because the king's authority came from God, not from the people. To claim otherwise was to invert the entire order of creation, to place the servant above the master, the creature above the creator. Charles was not just defending himself, he was defending the principle of monarchy itself. The president of the court, John Bradshaw, was having none of it. Bradshaw was a lawyer of modest reputation, who had been chosen for the job largely because more prominent legal figures had refused it. He wore a specially reinforced hat lined with steel plates, apparently concerned that someone might try to shoot him during the proceedings, not an unreasonable worry given the circumstances. Bradshaw insisted that Charles answer the charges, reminding him that he was being tried in the name of the people of England, of which you are elected king. This formula, that Charles was an elected king, accountable to those who had chosen him, was constitutionally innovative, to put it mildly. English kings were not elected, they inherited their thrones by divine right and blood descent. But Bradshaw and his colleagues were making up the rules as they went along, improvising a constitutional theory to justify what they had already decided to do. The trial lasted 7 days, though trial is perhaps too generous a term for what actually happened. Charles continued to refuse to plead, which meant that no evidence was heard and no witnesses were called. The prosecution had prepared an elaborate case documenting Charles's responsibility for the Civil War, but none of it was presented because the king's refusal to participate brought the proceedings to a halt. Instead, the court simply declared Charles guilty based on his refusal to plead, a legal fiction that satisfied nobody, but allowed the predetermined outcome to proceed. On January 27th, the court pronounced sentence Charles Stuart was to be put to death as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy. The 3 days between sentence and execution were filled with frantic activity. Some members of the court had second thoughts and tried to delay or prevent the execution. Foreign ambassadors protested. The French and Dutch sent urgent messages urging clemency. The Prince of Wales, Charles's eldest son and heir, sent a blank sheet of paper with his signature at the bottom, offering to agree to any terms if only his father's life would be spared. None of it made any difference. Oliver Cromwell and his closest allies were determined to see the thing through, convinced that God had delivered the king into their hands for judgment, and that to spare him now would be to defy divine providence. The death warrant was signed, hastily, with some signatures clearly added under pressure, and preparations were made for the execution. The scaffold was erected outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, that monument to Stuart magnificence with its Rubens ceiling celebrating the apotheosis of James I. The symbolism could not have been lost on anyone, least of all Charles himself. He would die beneath the painted vision of his father's heavenly glory, the propaganda of divine right monarchy providing the backdrop for its definitive refutation. The execution was scheduled for the afternoon of January 30th, a cold Tuesday, with crowds gathering in the street below the scaffold despite the winter chill. Charles prepared for death with the same attention to image that had characterized his entire reign. He wore 2 shirts, as we have mentioned, so that he would not shiver and appear afraid. He took communion, prayed with his chaplain, and said goodbye to those of his children who were present, Princess Elizabeth and the young Duke of Gloucester, who at 8 years old probably did not fully understand what was happening. Charles reportedly told the boy to remember that his father had died for the laws and liberties of the land, and to refuse the crown if it was ever offered to him by those who had murdered his father. The boy promised, though events would eventually test that promise in ways no one could have foreseen. The walk from St. James's Palace to Whitehall took Charles through St. James's Park, where he reportedly walked briskly and calmly, as if going to a normal appointment rather than his own execution. At Whitehall he waited for several hours while last-minute arrangements were made. There was some delay over the paperwork, which is perhaps the most English detail of the entire proceedings. Finally, around 2 in the afternoon, Charles stepped through a window of the banqueting house, onto the scaffold that had been built against its wall. The crowd was kept at a distance by lines of soldiers, which meant that most spectators could not hear the speech Charles delivered. This was probably intentional. The army did not want the king's final words to become a rallying cry for royalist sentiment. But Charles spoke anyway, addressing the small group of officials and clergy gathered on the scaffold itself. He maintained his innocence, insisted that he had always sought the good of his people, and declared himself a martyr for the true Protestant religion and the ancient liberties of England. He forgave his enemies, prayed for the salvation of his soul, and prepared to meet his God. The actual execution was mercifully quick. Charles knelt at the block, said a few final prayers, and gave the signal, stretching out his hands that he was ready. The executioner, whose identity was carefully concealed behind a mask and disguise, brought down the axe in a single stroke that severed the head cleanly. A witness reported that the crowd let out a groan that he would remember for the rest of his life. Not a cheer, not applause, but a sound of collective shock at what they had just witnessed. Whatever people thought of Charles as a king, seeing the actual execution of an anointed monarch was something else entirely. The aftermath was complicated. The body and head were retrieved and sewn back together so that Charles could be given a decent burial. The request to inter him in Westminster Abbey alongside his ancestors was denied. The new regime did not want his tomb becoming a site of royalist pilgrimage, and he was buried instead at Windsor Castle, in the vault of Henry VIII. The banqueting house was cleaned, the scaffold was dismantled, and England settled into its new identity as a kingless commonwealth, or tried to anyway. The execution of Charles I sent shockwaves across Europe. Kings had been deposed before, had been murdered in palace coups, had died in suspicious circumstances that everyone politely pretended were natural causes. But a king had never before been publicly tried and executed by his own subjects, with all the apparatus of legality and judicial procedure. The message was unmistakable. Monarchs could be held accountable, could be judged by their people, could lose not just their crowns but their lives if they ruled badly enough. This was a revolutionary proposition in a continent where the divine right of kings was still the dominant theory of political legitimacy. The crowned heads of Europe reacted with a mixture of horror and calculation. The horror was genuine. What had happened in England could happen anywhere, and monarchs everywhere suddenly felt less secure on their thrones. The calculation was about whether to intervene, to punish the regicides, to restore the Stuart heir to his stolen inheritance. In the end, most European powers decided that intervention was not worth the cost and risk. They expressed their disapproval through diplomatic snubs and refused recognition of the new English Republic, but they did not send armies. The Stuarts would have to recover their throne on their own, which they eventually did, though it would take 11 years. The republic that emerged from Charles's execution was called the Commonwealth, a term that consciously echoed classical republican models while avoiding the word republic itself. England was now governed by a parliament that was itself a shadow of its former self. The House of Lords had been abolished, and the House of Commons had been purged of anyone unwilling to support the trial and execution of the king. What remained was a rump, a fragment of the elected body, claiming to represent the English people while representing primarily itself. The ironies of a supposedly democratic revolution being carried out by an ever smaller group of self-appointed guardians was not lost on contemporaries, though those who pointed it out tended to find themselves in trouble. The dominant figure of the Commonwealth period was Oliver Cromwell, the cavalry commander who had done more than anyone else to win the Civil War for Parliament, and who would eventually become a king in all but name. Cromwell was a complex figure, deeply religious, genuinely committed to liberty of conscience, capable of both mercy and ruthless brutality depending on circumstances. He had signed Charles's death warrant, believing it to be God's will, and he would spend the next decade trying to create a godly commonwealth that would justify the terrible act with which it began. He never quite succeeded. The Republic lurched from crisis to crisis, unable to find a stable constitutional form, unable to reconcile the competing demands of army, parliament, and people. In 1653, Cromwell dissolved the Rump Parliament and became Lord Protector, effectively a military dictator with a fancy title. The Protectorate was monarchy in disguise, which everyone recognised but nobody quite knew what to do about. Cromwell lived in royal palaces, sat on something very like a throne, and was addressed with elaborate ceremonies that would not have been out of place at the court of Charles I. He was even offered the crown itself, which he agonised over before eventually declining, partly because the army would not accept it, partly because accepting a crown would have made a mockery of everything the revolution had supposedly stood for. So England had a Lord Protector instead of a king, which was somehow supposed to be different, though the practical differences were hard to discern. Cromwell died in September 1658, probably of malaria complicated by a urinary infection, though the exact cause remains uncertain. He was succeeded by his son Richard, which was about as monarchical as a succession could be while still technically not being a monarchy. Richard Cromwell was a decent, well-meaning man who had no particular talent for politics and no particular desire for power. He lasted less than 9 months before the army forced him out, plunging England into a period of political chaos as various factions competed for control. By early 1660, it was becoming clear that the Republican experiment had failed, and minds were turning to the exiled Stuart prince, who had been waiting patiently in Europe for exactly this moment. Charles II was 30 years old when he returned to England in May 1660, the same age his father had been when he came to the throne. But Charles was a very different man from his father, shaped by experiences that Charles I could never have imagined. He had been a teenager during the Civil War, had commanded a royalist army in the west of England, had escaped to France after the catastrophic defeat at Worcester in 1651. He had spent 9 years in exile, dependent on the charity of foreign courts, often without money for basic necessities, watching helplessly as his enemies ruled his kingdom. These experiences had taught Charles lessons that his father had never learned, that survival sometimes required flexibility, that principles were luxuries that defeated monarchs could not always afford, that it was better to bend than to break. The restoration of 1660 was accomplished with remarkably little bloodshed, especially considering the violence that had preceded it. Charles issued the Declaration of Breda, promising a general pardon for nearly everyone who had opposed his father, religious toleration for tender consciences, and the settlement of property disputes according to law. These promises were carefully vague. Charles was committing himself to very little while appearing to offer everything, but they were enough to smooth the path to his return. On May 29th, his 30th birthday, Charles rode into London through cheering crowds, the same streets that had witnessed his father's execution, now celebrating the restoration of his family's throne. The settlement that followed was generous, at least by the standards of 17th century score settling. Most of those who had served the Commonwealth and Protectorate were pardoned and allowed to keep their property. The regicides, those who had signed Charles I's death warrant, were a different matter. Those who were still alive and could be caught were tried for treason and executed with the full gruesome ceremony that English law provided for traitors. A few escaped abroad and spent the rest of their lives in hiding. The bodies of Cromwell, his son-in-law Henry Ireton, and the regicide John Bradshaw were exhumed from Westminster Abbey, hung in chains at Tyburn, and then decapitated, their heads displayed on poles outside Westminster Hall. It was retroactive revenge against enemies who were safely dead, but it satisfied the desire to punish someone for the previous 2 decades. The court that assembled around Charles II was deliberately, almost aggressively different from the court of his father. Where Charles I had been formal, dignified, obsessed with protocol and propriety, Charles II was informal, approachable, and utterly unconcerned with conventional morality. The king's mistresses were not just tolerated but celebrated, parading through the court with their royal bastards, competing for gifts and attention with a shamelessness that shocked foreign visitors. Barbara Villiers, Countess of Castlemaine, was the most notorious, beautiful, greedy, and spectacularly unfaithful even to her royal lover. She bore the king at least 5 children and extracted a fortune in gifts and pensions before being replaced by younger rivals. Louise de Keroualle, a French noblewoman sent by Louis XIV to influence English policy, became Charles's last great mistress and the grandmother of several of England's most distinguished families. And then there was Nell Gwynn, the orange seller turned actress who became the most popular of Charles's women, precisely because she was so unlike the others, cheerful, unpretentious, and apparently genuinely fond of the king rather than just his money. The moral contrast with the Puritan years could hardly have been sharper. The theatres that Cromwell had closed were reopened, and for the first time women were allowed to perform on the English stage. The plays that entertained Restoration audiences were bawdy, cynical, and often shocking, the Restoration comedies that are still performed today, with their plots about adultery, seduction, and social climbing. The court set the tone, and the court's tone was one of sophisticated libertinism, a deliberate rejection of everything the Puritans had stood for. If the godly had banned dancing, the Restoration would dance. If the godly had condemned theatre, the Restoration would make theatre the centre of cultural life. If the godly had preached chastity and sobriety, the Restoration would embrace sex and alcohol with enthusiasm. This reaction against Puritanism was partly genuine and partly political. Charles and his courtiers really did enjoy the pleasures they so ostentatiously pursued. The king's appetite for women, gambling and entertainment was legendary. But the visible rejection of Puritan values also served a political purpose, associating the new regime with freedom and pleasure, while associating the old regime with repression and joylessness. The Restoration propaganda was remarkably effective. To this day, most people's image of Puritanism is shaped more by Restoration caricature than by historical reality. The actual Puritans had not been the pleasure-hating killjoys of popular imagination. They drank beer, had sex, and enjoyed music like everyone else. But the Restoration needed villains, and the Puritans fit the bill. Behind the facade of hedonism, however, serious anxieties lurked. The religious settlement of the Restoration was far less tolerant than Charles had promised in the Declaration of Breda. The Church of England was restored with its bishops and ceremonies, and laws were passed excluding from office anyone who would not conform to its practices. Puritan ministers who could not accept the restored church were ejected from their livings, over 2,000 of them in the Great Ejection of 1662. Catholics were theoretically even worse off, still subject to the penal laws that made their religion a crime. The promised toleration for tender consciences turned out to mean toleration only for consciences that were not too tender. Charles himself was more tolerant than his Parliament, but his tolerance raised its own problems. The king had Catholic sympathies. How strong they were, and when exactly he acquired them, remained debated, and he was surrounded by Catholics at court, including his brother and heir James, who had converted openly in the early 1670s. Charles attempted twice to issue declarations of indulgence that would have suspended the penal laws against both Catholics and Protestant dissenters, and both times Parliament forced him to withdraw. The fear of Catholicism that had poisoned English politics since the Reformation was still very much alive, and Charles's apparent willingness to tolerate Catholics fed suspicions that he was planning something far worse than toleration. These suspicions exploded in the popish plot hysteria of 1678 to 1681. A disreputable informer named Titus Oates came forward with claims of a vast Catholic conspiracy to murder the king, massacre Protestants, and place the Catholic Duke of York on the throne. Oates's story was full of holes and contradictions, and he was almost certainly lying about most of it, but the country was in a mood to believe the worst about Catholics. The suspicious death of a magistrate who had been investigating Oates's claims added fuel to the fire. For the next 3 years, England was gripped by anti-Catholic panic, with dozens of innocent people executed on the testimony of Oates and other professional informers. The House of Commons tried repeatedly to exclude James from the succession, and Charles was forced to dissolve Parliament after Parliament to prevent the passage of an exclusion bill that would have disinherited his brother. The exclusion crisis, as this period is known, was in some ways a replay of the conflicts that had destroyed Charles I. Once again, a Stuart king was at odds with Parliament over fundamental questions of power and legitimacy. Once again, religious anxieties were intertwined with constitutional disputes. Once again, the country seemed to be sliding towards civil war. But Charles II handled the crisis far more skillfully than his father had handled similar challenges. He made tactical retreats when necessary, allowed the hysteria to burn itself out, and waited for public opinion to swing back in his favour. By 1681 the tide had turned. The Whigs who had championed exclusion were in retreat, their leader in exile, their cause discredited. Charles spent the last 4 years of his reign in relative peace, governing without Parliament and receiving secret subsidies from Louis XIV that freed him from dependence on parliamentary taxes. Charles died in February 1685 after a short illness, possibly a stroke. On his deathbed, he was received into the Catholic Church by a priest who had been smuggled into the palace, finally acknowledging openly the faith that he had apparently held secretly for years. His last words were reportedly an apology to those around him for taking so long to die, which was characteristic of his sardonic wit. He left his kingdom to his Catholic brother James, having failed to produce a legitimate heir despite decades of enthusiastic effort with various women. The fears that had driven the exclusion crisis were about to be realised. England would have a Catholic king for the first time since Mary Tudor, over a century earlier. The Restoration era ended as it had begun, with fundamental questions about religion and power unresolved. Charles II had managed to survive where his father had failed, partly through skill and partly through luck, but he had not solved the underlying problems that had caused the Civil War. The relationship between Crown and Parliament remained contested. The religious divisions that had torn the country apart remained open wounds. The question of what would happen when a Catholic king tried to rule a Protestant country had been deferred, not answered. James II would provide the answer, and it would not be the one he hoped for. Looking back at the arc from regicide to restoration, what stands out is how much changed and how much stayed the same. The execution of Charles I was supposed to inaugurate a new era, a godly commonwealth that would break with the corruptions of monarchy and create something better. Instead, it produced a decade of military rule followed by the return of the very dynasty it had tried to destroy. The Restoration was supposed to heal the wounds of civil war and create a lasting settlement between Crown and Parliament. Instead, it produced religious persecution, political hysteria, and the succession of a Catholic king who would be overthrown within 3 years. The 17th century kept trying to resolve the conflicts of the 16th century and kept failing. The final resolution would only come with the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and even then the echoes of these earlier struggles would continue to reverberate for generations. The execution of Charles I remains one of the most dramatic moments in English history, a turning point that contemporaries recognised as such even as they lived through it. The image of the king on the scaffold, maintaining his dignity to the end, created a martyr cult that persisted for centuries. The Restoration Court's deliberate hedonism was partly a reaction against the grimness of the interregnum, an assertion that life could be enjoyed rather than merely endured. The two periods, the stern republic and the merry monarchy, define each other by contrast, each making sense only in relation to what came before and after. Charles II understood this better than most. He knew that his throne rested on the memory of his father's martyrdom and the failure of the Republican alternative. He cultivated an image of easygoing tolerance precisely because his father's rigid principles had led to disaster. He survived where his father had perished because he was willing to compromise, to retreat, to wait for better opportunities rather than forcing confrontations he could not win. These were not noble qualities exactly, but they were effective ones. Charles II kept his head, in both senses of the phrase, and he died in his bed rather than on a scaffold. For a Stuart, that counted as a major achievement. The contrast between father and son illuminates something important about the Stuart tragedy. It was not inevitable. Charles I could have survived if he'd been more flexible. Charles II did survive by being more flexible. The same problems that destroyed the father were managed successfully by the son, at least for a while. The Stuart curse, if there was one, was not cosmic but characterological, a tendency toward rigidity, principle, and self-righteousness that made compromise feel like betrayal. Charles II escaped this curse, but his brother James did not, and the consequences would be catastrophic. The trial and execution of Charles I also established a precedent that would echo far beyond England. The idea that rulers could be held accountable, that sovereignty ultimately resided in the people rather than in the crown, that tyranny could be resisted and punished. These ideas, forged in the crisis of the English Civil War, would shape revolutionary movements for centuries to come. The American and French revolutionaries of the 18th century looked back to the English example, finding inspiration in the actions of men who had dared to bring a king to justice. The regicides of 1649 might have been horrified by some of their intellectual descendants, but they had opened a door that could not be closed. The Restoration, for its part, established the template for how deposed monarchies could return from exile and reclaim their thrones. The combination of military collapse, political chaos, and popular nostalgia that brought Charles II back to England would be repeated, with variations in other countries and other centuries. The Restoration also demonstrated the limits of revolutionary change, how hard it is to create something genuinely new, how easy it is to fall back into familiar patterns once the revolutionary moment passes. England tried to abolish monarchy and ended up with a quasi-monarchy under Cromwell. It executed one king and ended up welcoming his son with cheering crowds. The wheel turned, and the Stuarts returned, though not forever. The religious dimension of the Restoration era deserves particular attention because it would prove decisive in the next phase of Stuart history. Charles II's personal religion was a mystery even to those closest to him. He attended Anglican services, defended the established church against Puritan and Catholic alike, and generally behaved as a Protestant monarch should. But he also showed sympathy for Catholics, attempted to ease their legal disabilities, and surrounded himself with Catholic advisers and mistresses. His mother, Henrietta Maria, was Catholic. His brother James was Catholic. His favourite mistress, Louise de Querouaille, was Catholic. The circle of French influence that surrounded Charles, and the French money that funded his government, was thoroughly Catholic. Whether Charles himself believed in the Catholic faith or merely found it politically convenient is impossible to say with certainty. What is certain is that his deathbed conversion was the final act of a life spent carefully concealing his true beliefs, if he had any true beliefs beyond the desire for survival and pleasure. The religious anxieties of the Restoration period were not merely paranoid fantasies. Catholic France under Louis XIV was the dominant power in Europe, and Louis made no secret of his desire to extirpate Protestantism wherever he could reach it. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, just months after Charles II's death, demonstrated what Catholic monarchs were capable of when they felt strong enough to act. Hundreds of thousands of French Protestants were forced to convert, flee, or suffer persecution. English Protestants looked across the Channel and saw their possible future if the Catholics ever gained the upper hand. Their fears were not irrational, even if the specific accusations of the Popish plot were mostly fabricated. The court culture of the Restoration, for all its apparent frivolity, also reflected deeper changes in English society. The theatres that reopened in 1660 were not just entertainments, they were forums for debating the issues of the day, often in coded or allegorical form. The coffee houses that proliferated in London during this period became centres of political discussion, where men of various classes could gather to read newspapers, exchange gossip, and argue about public affairs. The press, though still subject to censorship, was livelier and more diverse than it had ever been. Public opinion was becoming a force that governments had to reckon with, even if they did not always reckon with it wisely. The period from 1649 to 1685 was thus a kind of laboratory for political experimentation, with England trying various forms of government and finding none of them entirely satisfactory. The Commonwealth, the Protectorate, the restored monarchy, each had its advocates and its critics, its achievements and its failures. Out of this experimentation would eventually emerge the constitutional monarchy and parliamentary government that Britain practices to this day, but the path to that destination was neither straight nor painless. The men of blood and the merry monarchs, the regicides and the libertines, all played their parts in a drama whose final act was still to come. The mid-1660s should have been a period of consolidation and triumph for the restored Stuart monarchy. Charles II had been back on the throne for 5 years, the worst of the post-Civil War tensions had eased, and the country was settling into something like normalcy. Instead, England was about to experience a sequence of catastrophes so devastating that even hardened contemporaries struggled to explain them as anything other than divine judgment. Plague, fire, and military humiliation arrived in rapid succession, testing the restored monarchy in ways that nobody had anticipated, and raising questions about God's opinion of the Stuart regime that would never be entirely silenced. The Great Plague of 1665 was not the first time bubonic plague had visited London. The disease had been a recurring nightmare for centuries, flaring up periodically and killing thousands before subsiding again. But the outbreak that began in the spring of 1665 was different in scale, a pandemic that would eventually kill perhaps 100,000 Londoners out of a population of roughly 460,000. That is approximately 1 person in 4 or 5, depending on whose estimates you trust, a mortality rate that modern minds can barely comprehend. Imagine walking down your street and knowing that 1 out of every 4 houses would lose someone to a horrible, painful death over the next 18 months. That was London in 1665. The plague arrived, as it usually did, through trade, probably carried by fleas on rats that travelled with merchandise from the Netherlands, where the disease had been circulating. The first cases appeared in the parish of St Giles in the Fields, a poor area outside the city walls where overcrowding and inadequate sanitation provided ideal conditions for the disease to spread. By summer, the outbreak had moved into the city proper, and panic was beginning to set in. Those who could afford to leave London did so, including, unfortunately, most of the physicians, clergy and officials who might have organised a response. The court fled to Oxford, the Parliament was prorogued, and the city was left to fend for itself under the direction of the Lord Mayor and a skeleton crew of aldermen who stayed at their posts. The measures taken to combat the plague were well-intentioned but largely ineffective, because nobody understood how the disease actually spread. The prevailing theory held that plague was caused by miasma, bad air arising from filth and corruption, so authorities ordered the burning of fires in the streets to purify the atmosphere and the killing of dogs and cats that were thought to spread infection. The dog and cat cull was particularly counterproductive, since these animals actually helped control the rat population that was the real vector of transmission. The authorities also ordered the quarantine of infected houses, with the inhabitants sealed inside and a red cross painted on the door, along with the words, "Lord have mercy upon us." Being locked in a house with a plague victim was essentially a death sentence, and many people tried desperately to conceal illness in their families to avoid this fate. The death toll climbed throughout the summer, peaking in September when over 7,000 people were dying each week. The burial grounds filled up and overflowed. Plague pits were dug to accommodate the bodies that could not be buried individually. The famous plague doctor costume, the long robes and beaked mask stuffed with herbs, dates from this period, though its effectiveness was entirely psychological. The streets were empty except for the death carts making their rounds, the cries of "Bring out your dead" becoming a grim refrain of daily life. Those who remained in the city lived in constant fear, avoiding contact with neighbours, watching for the telltale signs of infection, the fever, the swollen lymph nodes called buboes that gave the disease its name, the black spots that indicated death. Was near. The moral interpretation of the plague was immediate and almost universal. This was divine punishment. But for what? The Puritans, who had been excluded from the Church of England, saw it as God's judgment on a sinful nation that had restored an immoral monarchy and persecuted the godly. The court's supporters saw it as punishment for the regicide of Charles I, the sins of the previous generation being visited upon their children. Catholics saw it as the consequence of heresy and schism. Everyone agreed that God was angry, they just disagreed about why. The plague thus became another front in the religious and political conflicts that had divided England for a century, each faction interpreting the disaster in ways that confirmed their existing beliefs. Charles II's absence from London during the plague was understandable from a practical standpoint. A king who died of plague would not be useful to anyone, but it was politically damaging. The contrast with certain heroic figures who stayed behind, like the Earl of Craven who organised relief efforts, made the court look cowardly and indifferent to popular suffering. When the plague finally began to subside in the autumn of 1665, continuing at lower levels through the winter and into the following spring, the restored monarchy had survived but had not covered itself in glory. The city that emerged from the plague was traumatised, depopulated, and suspicious that more disasters might be on the way. They were right to be suspicious. On September 2nd, 1666, a fire broke out in a bakery on Pudding Lane, not far from London Bridge. Fires were common in 17th century cities, where buildings were mostly wooden and open flames were used for cooking, heating, and lighting. Most fires were contained quickly, extinguished by neighbours, or pulled down before they could spread. But this fire was different. A strong east wind was blowing, the summer had been unusually dry, and the tightly packed wooden buildings of medieval London provided perfect fuel. Within hours, the fire had spread beyond any hope of containment, and the city began to burn. The Great Fire of London lasted 4 days, from September 2nd to September 6th, and destroyed approximately 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and most of the public buildings within the old city walls. St. Paul's Cathedral, the medieval masterpiece that had dominated the London skyline for centuries, was gutted, its lead roof melting and running down the streets in molten rivers. The Royal Exchange, the heart of London's commercial life, was reduced to ashes. Entire neighbourhoods vanished, their residents fleeing with whatever possessions they could carry, watching helplessly as generations of accumulated wealth went up in smoke. The response to the fire was chaotic but eventually effective. The traditional method of firefighting, pulling down buildings to create fire breaks, was attempted but often too late, the fire jumping the gaps before they could be completed. King Charles and his brother James both came into the city to direct firefighting efforts. which was good for their public image even if their actual contribution to containing the blaze was limited. Eventually, a combination of fire breaks, the exhaustion of available fuel, and a shift in the wind brought the fire under control. By the time it was finally extinguished, approximately 80% of the area within the old city walls had been destroyed. The death toll from the fire was remarkably low. Officially only 6 people died, though the true number was probably somewhat higher since the poor and homeless who perished in the flames would not necessarily have been recorded. But the destruction of property was catastrophic, and the economic disruption would last for years. Thousands of people were suddenly homeless, camping in the fields outside the city with whatever they had managed to salvage. The mercantile and craft economy that had made London one of the wealthiest cities in Europe was shattered. Businesses destroyed along with their stock, tools and records. The rebuilding would cost an estimated £10 million, an almost inconceivable sum at a time when the entire annual revenue of the English crown was less than £2 million. The coincidence of plague and fire coming in consecutive years seemed too terrible to be random. Once again, the question of divine judgment arose, and once again, everyone had their preferred interpretation. But this time, a new explanation gained traction. The fire had been deliberately set by England's enemies, specifically by Catholics or foreign agents working to destroy the Protestant kingdom. A simple accident in a bakery was too mundane an explanation for such a catastrophe. Surely malevolent forces must be involved. The fact that the fire had started in the house of a French Catholic, Thomas Fariner, the king's baker, whose assistant was indeed French, added fuel to the conspiracy theories, if you will pardon the pun. A mentally unstable French watchmaker named Robert Hubert confessed to starting the fire on behalf of the Pope, and despite the obvious problems with his story, he changed his account multiple times and claimed to have started the fire in a location. It had not actually reached until later he was convicted and hanged. The authorities probably knew his confession was false, but a scapegoat was needed, and Hubert served the purpose. The belief that the fire had been a Catholic plot persisted for generations. The monument to the Great Fire, erected in the 1670s, originally carried an inscription blaming the treachery and malice of the Popish faction for the year disaster. The inscription was not removed until 1830, over a century and a half after the fire itself. Between the plague and the fire, England was also fighting and losing a war with the Dutch Republic. The Second Anglo-Dutch War had begun in 1665, driven by commercial rivalry and colonial competition. England and the Netherlands were both maritime powers competing for the same trade routes and the same colonial territories. War was almost inevitable given the stakes involved. The English navy had some initial successes, but the war quickly turned against them as Dutch naval superiority and English financial weakness became apparent. The nadir came in June 1667, when a Dutch fleet under Admiral Michiel de Ruyter sailed up the Medway, the river leading to the English naval base at Chatham. The English defences were inadequate. A chain stretched across the river was supposed to block enemy ships, but it had not been properly maintained, and the Dutch broke through with ease. They burned several English warships at anchor, captured the flagship Royal Charles, and towed it back to the Netherlands as a trophy. The sound of Dutch guns could be heard in London, and panic swept the city at the prospect of a full-scale invasion. The Medway raid was one of the most humiliating episodes in English naval history, a catastrophe that seemed to symbolise everything wrong with the restored Stuart regime. The navy that had been the pride of Cromwell's protectorate, that had defeated the Dutch in the First Anglo-Dutch War, was now unable to defend its own home waters. The blame fell partly on mismanagement and corruption in the naval administration, partly on Parliament's refusal to adequately fund the war, and partly on the King's diversion of naval funds to other purposes, including allegedly his mistresses. Samuel Pepys, who worked in the naval administration and kept the famous diary that is our best source for this period, recorded the shame and fear that gripped London as news of the disaster spread. The Treaty of Breda, signed in July 1667, ended the war on terms that were not as bad as they might have been. England kept New York, which had been captured from the Dutch in 1664, but the psychological damage was severe. England had been humiliated by a smaller nation, its pretensions to naval supremacy exposed as hollow. Combined with the plague and the fire, the Medway raid seemed to confirm that God was indeed angry with England, that the Restoration settlement was cursed, that the sins of the nation were being punished in ways both dramatic and unmistakable. Charles II survived these catastrophes, as he survived everything else through a combination of political skill, personal charm, and the absence of any obvious alternative. But his position was weakened, his government discredited, and his parliament increasingly restive. The fall of his chief minister Clarendon in 1667 was directly related to the disasters of the previous years. Someone had to take the blame, and the king was not going to volunteer himself. The remaining years of Charles's reign would be marked by continuing conflicts with Parliament, religious tensions that peaked in the popish plot hysteria, and the looming question of what would happen when the Catholic Duke of York inherited the throne. The catastrophes of 1665 and 1666 did not destroy the Stuart monarchy, but they revealed its weaknesses and foreshadowed the greater crisis that was to come. The religious interpretation of these disasters had a lasting effect on English political culture. The idea that national sins brought national punishments, that God intervened directly in human affairs to reward virtue and punish vice, was a commonplace of 17th century thought. But the specific application of this idea, that plague, fire, and military defeat were judgments on the Restoration settlement, gave ammunition to those who believed that the Stuart regime was fundamentally illegitimate, or at least fundamentally flawed. The disasters became part of the case against the Stuarts, evidence that could be cited whenever the question of divine favour arose, and in 17th century England the question of divine favour arose constantly. The rebuilding of London after the fire was one of the few bright spots in this grim period. The old medieval city with its narrow streets and wooden buildings was replaced by a new city of brick and stone, with wider streets and more regular building plots. Christopher Wren was commissioned to design a new St Paul's Cathedral, the magnificent Baroque structure that still dominates the London skyline today. Wren also designed over 50 other churches to replace those destroyed in the fire, creating the architectural landscape of the City of London that survived until the Blitz of World War II. The fire, for all its destruction, created an opportunity for urban improvement that would not otherwise have been possible. But urban improvement could not solve the fundamental problems of the Stuart regime. The question of the succession, what would happen when the Catholic James inherited the throne, hung over the last decade of Charles II's reign like a storm cloud, breaking periodically in political crises but never fully resolving. Charles managed these crises with his characteristic flexibility, but he could not prevent them from recurring, and he could not change the fact that his brother was a Catholic who would not renounce his faith. When Charles died in February 1685, the storm finally broke. James II came to the throne with certain advantages. He was the legitimate heir, accepted as such by everyone except the most radical Whigs. He had experience in government, having served as Lord High Admiral and having demonstrated genuine administrative competence. He had supporters among the Anglican establishment who believed in passive obedience to the divinely appointed monarch regardless of his religion, and he promised, at his accession, to preserve the established church and govern according to law. If James had kept these promises, or even appeared to keep them, he might have reigned successfully for decades. Instead, James embarked on a policy of aggressive Catholicization that alarmed even his supporters and united his enemies. He placed Catholics in positions of power in the army, the universities, and the government, despite laws that prohibited Catholics from holding such offices. He claimed the right to dispense individuals from the requirements of law, a prerogative power that his predecessors had used sparingly and that he used liberally to advance his religious agenda. He prosecuted the 7 bishops who petitioned against his declaration of indulgence, turning them into martyrs and heroes. He seemed to be building toward the restoration of Catholicism as the national religion, and Protestants who had hoped to wait out his reign began to fear that waiting was no longer an option. The birth of James Francis Edward Stuart in June 1688 transformed the situation from dangerous to critical. As long as James had no male heir, his Protestant daughters Mary and Anne would eventually inherit the throne, and whatever Catholic measures James imposed could be reversed after his death. A Catholic son changed everything. If this baby survived and was raised Catholic, which he certainly would be, England faced the prospect of a Catholic dynasty stretching into the indefinite future. Protestant England, which had defined itself against Catholicism for over a century, would be ruled by Catholic kings for generations to come. The response was swift. Within weeks of the birth, a group of prominent nobles and bishops sent an invitation to William of Orange, the Dutch stadtholder who was married to James's eldest daughter Mary. The invitation asked William to invade England with an army, ostensibly to investigate whether the baby was genuinely James's son or a substitute smuggled into the birthing chamber. The warming pan story was almost certainly false. The birth had been witnessed by dozens of people, but it provided a pretext for intervention that avoided the uncomfortable reality of simply deposing a legitimate king because his religion was unpopular. William accepted the invitation, though his motivations were more European than English. He was locked in a struggle with Louis XIV of France, and he needed English resources for that struggle. A Catholic England allied with France was his nightmare scenario. A Protestant England under his control was exactly what he needed. The invasion he launched in November 1688 was the largest amphibious operation in European history up to that point. Over 15,000 troops, carried by over 500 ships, and it succeeded beyond anyone's expectations because James II essentially refused to fight. James's failure to resist the invasion remains one of the great puzzles of 17th century history. He had an army, loyal officers, and a defensible position. William's forces were not overwhelming, and a determined resistance might have stopped or at least delayed the invasion. But James seemed to lose his nerve at the critical moment. He suffered severe nosebleeds that some historians have interpreted as psychosomatic, physical symptoms of psychological collapse. His commanders defected, including John Churchill, the future Duke of Marlborough. His own daughter Anne abandoned him and fled to join the invaders. Faced with disintegration rather than defeat, James decided to flee rather than fight. The first escape attempt failed when James was captured by fishermen in Kent who did not recognise him. William, who had no desire to make a martyr of the king, allowed James to escape again, and this time he made it to France, where Louis XIV welcomed him and installed him at the Palace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. James would spend the rest of his life in exile, plotting his return and leading failed military expeditions to Ireland and Scotland that came to nothing. He died in 1701, having never regained his throne, having never accepted that his subjects had the right to reject him. The constitutional settlement that followed James's departure, the Glorious Revolution as it came to be called, transformed the English monarchy forever. William and Mary were offered the throne jointly, not as hereditary successors but as chosen sovereigns who ruled by consent of Parliament. The Bill of Rights of 1689 laid out the terms of this new arrangement. No Catholic could ever sit on the English throne. Taxation and lawmaking required parliamentary consent. The monarch could not maintain a standing army in peacetime without Parliament's approval. Subjects had the right to petition the Crown and to bear arms for their defence. These provisions codified in law principles that previous Stuarts had resisted, creating a constitutional monarchy in which the sovereign was clearly subordinate to law and Parliament. The Act of Settlement of 1701 went further, establishing that the crown would pass to the Protestant House of Hanover if William, Mary and Anne all died without heirs, as indeed they did. The Stuart bloodline, which had held the English and Scottish thrones for over a century, was bypassed in favour of distant German cousins, whose primary qualification was their Protestant religion. James's son, the Old Pretender, and his grandson, Bonnie Prince Charlie, would spend the next half-century trying to reverse this settlement, leading Jacobite risings in 1715 and 1745 that came closer to success than is sometimes remembered but ultimately failed. The last Stuart claimant died in 1807, and with him died any realistic hope of Stuart restoration. The Glorious Revolution was thus the final act of the Stuart tragedy, the moment when the dynasty's hold on power was definitively broken. But it was also more than that. It was the resolution of the constitutional conflicts that had plagued England for nearly a century, the final answer to questions that had been asked since James I first lectured Parliament about divine right. Could the king tax without consent? No. Could the king make law without Parliament? No. Could the king suspend laws at will? No. Could the king impose his religion on his subjects? Absolutely not. The Glorious Revolution established that England was a constitutional monarchy, governed by the king in Parliament, with fundamental rights that not even the sovereign could override. This settlement was not democratic in any modern sense. The Parliament that now shared power with the Crown was still dominated by wealthy landowners and excluded the vast majority of the population from political participation. The religious toleration that the revolution brought was limited. Catholics and Protestant dissenters still faced significant disabilities. The revolution preserved existing social hierarchies even as it transformed political ones. But it established principles, the rule of law, the consent of the governed, the limits of executive power, that would have enormous consequences for the future of Britain and the world. The Stuart dynasty ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, a king fleeing in the night rather than facing his enemies in battle. It was an anticlimactic conclusion to a century of drama, but perhaps an appropriate one. The Stuarts had always believed that their cause would ultimately triumph because God was on their side, that divine providence would vindicate divine right. The Glorious Revolution demonstrated that God, or at least English Protestants, had other plans. The Stuart century was over, and a new era was beginning. Looking back at the entire Stuart story, from James I's arrival in England in 1603 to James II's flight in 1688, what stands out is the consistency of the dynasty's failures. 4 kings, each facing essentially the same problems: conflict with Parliament, religious division, the tension between royal prerogative and constitutional limits, and each failing to resolve them. James I planted the seeds of conflict. Charles I watered them with his blood. Charles II managed them without solving them. James II ensured that they would finally bear their bitter fruit. The Stuart tragedy was not inevitable, but it was remarkably consistent, the same patterns repeating across generations until catastrophe became unavoidable. The legacy of the Stuarts is paradoxical. They failed as rulers, losing their throne, their lives, their dynasty. But they succeeded in provoking a constitutional revolution that established the principles of limited government and parliamentary supremacy that would spread around the world. The American founders, drafting their own constitution a century later, looked back to the English Revolution and the Glorious Revolution for precedents and principles. The rights they enshrined in their Bill of Rights echoed the English Bill of Rights of 1689. The separation of powers they established was designed to prevent the concentration of authority that the Stuarts had sought and that Parliament had opposed. In failing, the Stuarts helped create the modern world. The fires that burned London, the plague that decimated its population, the enemies that humiliated its navy, these were catastrophes that tested the Stuart regime and found it wanting. But they were also preludes to something new, clearing away the old to make room for what would come after. The London that rose from the ashes of the Great Fire was a modern city, planned and built according to rational principles. The political settlement that emerged from the Glorious Revolution was a modern constitution, balancing power between Crown and Parliament in ways that have endured for over 3 centuries. The Stuart catastrophes were birth pangs as well as death throes, painful transitions from one era to another. The Stuarts themselves deserve neither complete condemnation nor complete sympathy. They were products of their time, holding beliefs that were common among European monarchs and that had been accepted in England for centuries. Their tragedy was not that they were uniquely wicked or uniquely foolish, but that they were unable to adapt to changing circumstances, unable to recognise that the world was moving in directions that left divine right monarchy behind. They clung to beliefs that their subjects were increasingly unwilling to accept, and they paid the price for that inflexibility. Charles I went to his death believing that he was right, and that history would vindicate him. In a sense it did. He is remembered as a martyr by some, as a tragic figure by others, rarely as the villain that his enemies portrayed. James II died in exile, convinced that his Protestant subjects had betrayed their lawful king, and that God would eventually restore his family to their throne. God did not, but the Jacobite cause remained alive for generations, a romantic lost cause that inspired poetry and rebellion long after it had any realistic chance of success. The Stuarts were wrong about divine right, but they were sincere in their beliefs, and there is something admirable about sincerity even in service of a mistaken cause. The story we have told tonight, of blood and crowns, of execution and restoration, of plague and fire and revolution, is the story of how modern Britain was born. It is a story of conflict and catastrophe, of ideals and interests clashing in ways that could only be resolved through violence. It is also a story of ordinary people caught up in extraordinary events, trying to make sense of a world that seemed to be coming apart around them. The plague victims in their sealed houses, the fire refugees in the fields outside London, the soldiers on both sides of the Civil War. They did not choose the times they lived in, but they lived through them as best they could. The Stuarts are gone now, their bloodline ended, their cause forgotten except by historians and enthusiasts. But the questions they raised, about the source of political authority, about the relationship between ruler and ruled, about the limits of government power remain as relevant as ever. Every society must answer these questions for itself, and the answers are never final. The Glorious Revolution settled the questions for England, but it did not settle them for humanity. The struggle between power and liberty, between tradition and change, between the few and the many, continues in every generation. The Stuarts lost that struggle, but the struggle itself goes on. And with that, we come to the end of our journey through the bloody history of Britain's most catastrophic dynasty. From Scottish moors to London scaffolds, from royal palaces to exile in France, the Stuarts blazed a trail of drama and disaster that has few parallels in European history. They gave us martyrs and villains, heroes and fools, moments of high tragedy and low comedy. They gave us, in the end, the constitutional monarchy that still governs Britain today, though they would hardly have recognised or approved of what their failures produced. The Jacobite cause that emerged from James II's exile would prove surprisingly durable, lasting well into the 18th century and inspiring some of the most romantic episodes in British history. The Old Pretender, as James Francis Edward came to be called, made two serious attempts to reclaim the throne, in 1708 and 1715, both of which failed due to a combination of bad luck, poor planning, and insufficient support. His son Charles Edward Stuart, the young Pretender or Bonnie Prince Charlie, came even closer in 1745, leading a Highland army all the way to Derby before being forced to retreat. The crushing defeat at Culloden in 1746 ended the Jacobite military threat forever. But the romantic mythology of the lost cause only grew stronger with time. The Jacobites represented the road not taken, the alternative history in which the Stuarts kept their throne and divine right monarchy survived into the modern era. It is tempting to speculate about what such a Britain might have looked like, probably more like the absolute monarchies of continental Europe, with a weaker parliament and a stronger crown. Whether this would have been better or worse depends on one's political sympathies, but it would certainly have been different. The constitutional monarchy that actually emerged from the Glorious Revolution created a political system that proved remarkably adaptable, surviving the challenges of the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries while its continental counterparts collapsed into revolution. The Stuart failure, paradoxically, may have been Britain's success. So now, as the story of the Stuarts comes to its close, it is time for you to close your eyes as well. The fires are out, the plague has passed, the revolution is complete. The new era is beginning, and you have earned your rest. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most turbulent centuries. May your dreams be peaceful, even if the history we discussed was anything but. Good night and sweet dreams.